Let's get peppy! Welcome to PEP 111, the final PEP of 2022. I am here with everyone's favourite special PEPcaster, Melina Wicks. Hello, Melina.
Hello, everyone.
Now, we have quite a lot to get into. As always, I'm going to try to not make this a 4.5 hour podcast like our last one at the end of last year, Melina. I do need to do some housekeeping though, as always. First of all, I am going to finish off this podcast by telling you what is happening next year. So that is a teaser to keep you listening for no other reason. And I should also note that we are currently recording on Thursday. We're probably going to finish recording this on a Friday. This is going up on a Sunday, so it may be out of date. But I don't think so, because we're not talking about very topical stuff today. This was going to be a double Pepcast with Bill Wyman, but I realized that was just insane. Like, why was I doing that? That was going to be 4.5 hours long, and this is the last podcast. I can just put it up 2 days later. So that's what I'm going to do. So you probably watched, well, I won't flatter myself. I'm not saying you've already watched the Bill Wyman one, but hopefully you have 6 months to watch both of them. So there's no rush. Now, Melina, the first thing which we've been talking about that we have wanted to talk about for ages is me and Dr. Dave talked about, Dr. Dave and I, sorry, Mum, she doesn't like my grammatical errors. Dr. Dave and I were talking about Elon's first week, and we've gone deathly silent since then. And we're pretty much the only people on earth that have gone deathly silent about Elon for the last month. So why don't we catch up on the second, third, fourth, and fifth week? Are you up for that there?
Yep.
I hope so, because I've prepared it. Okay, so I am going to tell you my general theory of what is going on with Twitter. Well, the problem with Elon Musk's, inverted commas, freedom agenda. And this is a very generic problem. This is a problem that anyone would face if they're in his place. I do not blame Elon Musk for what has happened with regards to this problem. But then I'll let you in, and then we can tic-tac-toe from there, okay? All right, so this is my general theory of the problem with Twitter, or that Elon Musk is facing on Twitter. Okay, Elon Musk has what he calls a free speech agenda. He has referred to himself as a free speech absolutist, whatever that means. There's a quote from him on Twitter: "My commitment to free speech extends even to not banning the account following my plane, even though that is a direct personal safety risk," he has said. And he also infamously said when he took over, comedy is now legal on Twitter, which is related to this, the free speech and free comedy, right? Okay, so here is the issue. There's a generic issue that anyone would face, and that is Musk has overpaid massively for a site that is likely to lose considerably more than $1 billion a year. And every time he can't pay back his loan, he has to sell more of his Tesla stock, which is a problem. Okay, so he needs money. But 90% of his platform's revenue comes from advertising, right? And so and free speech doesn't go with advertising at all, right? Because let me quote Josh Marshall. Advertisers don't want to be near controversy. Indeed, they don't even want to be near things that are upsetting or agitating. This is why all political and political news media face an inverse premium in advertising, because the content is inherently polarizing. You can show the same ad to the same people the same amount of times, and you'll get more money if the content is fashion or parenthood or entertainment than if it's politics. It's a bedrock rule of the world of advertising. Now that is at the best of times. That political media gets you less advertising dollars at the best of times. Free speech times are not the best of times, okay? Because truly free speech on the internet creates a bunch of bigotry and abuse and trolling right next to the brands that are paying to improve their image. So those brands will drop out. That's the consequence of free speech when it comes to advertising. In fact, if you get around saying things like comedy is now legal on Twitter, what that does, and you also people know that you're struggling with advertising, what that does is that encourages amateur comedians everywhere to target your advertisers in the most blatant possible way because it's funny. I know. I've done this before. This is exactly what we would have done with the Chaser. I believe that the Chaser, which I'm not really a part of at the moment, are still doing it. You target the advertisers because it's hilarious because everyone knows he needs advertisers and he's Mr. Free Speech. So that's just fun, okay? So that's another problem. And that's exactly why everyone started impersonating everyone, because that was a funny way to make fun of the situation. Okay, we'll get to that in a second. Now, remember as well, Twitter is relatively tiny compared to the other social media platforms, and it's particularly political, much more political than Instagram or some of the others, or TikTok. So why wouldn't advertisers just head to a bigger platform that has less problems and less politics, which of course they do. Okay, so the next option then is if you can't rely on advertising anymore to make money, you try subscriptions, which is what Elon Musk tried. But why would people pay for a service that they can get for free on a different platform, which they can? And if they do pay for it, you know what happens then? The exact people who advertisers most want to target, which are heavy users of your platform who have lots of money, those people can't reach them because they're subscribers and they don't have advertising. So it actually siphons off the exact people that the advertisers want to hit, which makes advertising even less valuable, which means they pay you less, which means for all your subscription revenue, you lose advertising revenue. You may even make a loss, or you may break even, or you may make a tiny, tiny profit for a lot of annoyance. And all of that is not even the biggest problem. The biggest problem is that Apple and Google have their own rules for what they regard as acceptable conduct, and they don't believe in free speech. And Apple and Google matter very much because they control the app stores. So if you run a site that violates their particular content rules, then you're not on the app store and you're screwed completely. So, and I should say, by the way, incidentally, the head of Apple's App Store, Phil Schiller, deleted his Twitter account last week. So that's not a great sign for Elon Musk there. Okay, so then you say, okay, we've got a problem here. We're going to censor people as little as we can, because we're free speech absolutists, but we're going to just downgrade problematic material. When you downgrade it, it's less likely to appear next to an advertiser. So it's a more attractive product for advertising, and you solve some of your problems. But you're not censoring, you're just downgrading. Now, that's where Elon Musk is at right now. I'll quote, "New Twitter policy is freedom of speech, but not freedom of reach. Negative/hate," that rhymes, that's really catchy. Negative/hate tweets will be max deboosted and demonetized, so no ads or other revenue to Twitter. You won't find the tweet unless you specifically seek it out, which is no different from the rest of the internet. Now that has pissed everyone off. I'll quote journalist Yasha Ali. "If I attack the supreme leader of Iran, is that considered a negative/hate tweet? How will the system tell the difference?" Great question, Yasha. I'll also quote Congressman Thomas Massey. "Will it be transparent? Will it be according to a published policy? Will we know when it's happening? If not, how is this any different from the old Twitter?" And that is the nub of it right there. Elon is pretty much back to where he began with old Twitter, despite his best intentions. And I do believe he has the best of intentions with regards to the free speech thing. And there's a simple reason for that. Generally, in life, not just Twitter, every time, when you see something that's shit that's happening, it's not because the people who are running it are evil or they're awful. It's because the system that they're working in creates incentives that means that a shit result is the logical outcome of rational people making rational decisions. That's what 99% of people are. They're not heroes. They're not villains. There's rational people responding to incentives. And I wish people would internalize that, because it applies to everything. And there are conspiracy theories all over the place about evil pedophiles and all the rest of it. And not even, forget the pedophiles. I shouldn't even have said that, because it's not about QAnon. This is about just in life. Everyone goes, oh yeah, the government, oh, they're bastards. Oh. And then the next lot get in and they do the same thing. And it's because they're responding to incentives. Rational incentives. So if you want to change what's shit, the first thing you need to do is do the work to understand how the system works and why it creates that outcome. And then you need to either change that system so the incentives are then different, or you need to be prepared to swallow the consequence of defying those incentives. And Elon Musk did not bother to do that. He is an arrogant, wealthy man-child who thinks he knows best. And so he just went ahead, bull in the china shop, and go, I'll sort it out. These bastards, I'm a free speech absolutist. I'm not going to fall for this. And so now he's discovering why Twitter is how it is. And he's not prepared to defy the incentives and go bankrupt. Because that's what happens when you defy the incentives that I just described. You lose a huge amount of money. Now, if he wants to swallow that, that's fine. But clearly he's not prepared to. So he ends up in the same place that the old people who weren't prepared to swallow it went. And by the way, as a little side, before I ask you what you think about all this, about my general theory, I've lived this, because this is a story of Planet America. Right? Like Planet America, I started off because I was trying to make a different kind of news show, because I was sick of making fun. You remember this well. We did the hamster wheel together, and I was pouring shit all over journalists, and I thought to myself, you know what? These journalists, one day I just woke up and realized these journalists are all younger than me. They are, I mean, I was like 31 or 32. I thought they are all in their 20s. I have had better education than any of them. I'm in a much better position to cover the news than any of them, and I'm pouring shit on them. I'm punching down in the biggest possible way. And part of their problem is they are scared of me, and they are scared of all kinds of criticism. But I am one of the loudest critics of them, and I know they watch me. I know they do. I see them tweet about it, and they live in fear of ending up on our show. And I stay up all night watching them and scrutinizing them for the tiniest of errors, when that is not, that they are responding to the situation they are in. They are under pressure and they are responding accordingly. And what I should do is try and do better, because I'm in a position to do better. And that's why we did Play America. And when I started doing Play America, I realized very quickly what their incentives were, the reason why they are shit. And because the same incentives were occurring to me. And so I thought to myself, you know what? I'm going to swallow the consequences. I made the decision to not do what Elon's doing, and to say, you know what? I am going to make no money. I am going to work way too hard and I'm not going to have the support or resources that I need to make this show properly, but I'm just going to do it anyway and do it myself. And I'm going to pay for the graphics guys because the ABC can't afford them, which is what we did for the first 2 years. And that was stupid. I made a loss. Making Play America. I didn't gain income. I actually lost money. And I'm still not making a huge amount of money. But the fact is, I was prepared to do that because I was in a position with, not because I'm a hero, it's because I had this huge TV nest egg that I could sit on, and so I could pay the bills with. So that was cool. I was in a lucky position I could do that. But if I hadn't chosen to either change the system, which you can't from a position of having a shitty show on ABC News 24, or swallowing the consequences, I would have ended up making exactly the same show that I was criticizing before. And Elon Musk is not prepared to swallow the consequences. And so he is making exactly the same social media platform that he was criticizing before. What are your thoughts on my general theory?
I agree with your general theory. And it's interesting, like thinking about Elon and the situation he's in now. Like, I feel like he seems really stuck between just wanting to own something he likes and make it exactly as he wants it to be versus trying to run it as a successful business. Yeah. Because I feel like, he was a Twitter power user. He obviously really enjoyed being on Twitter. Obviously things also he didn't like about it and was sort of agitating for. And then when you're the richest man in the world, you're like, well, I like this thing. I'm just going to make it my thing. And then it can be exactly how I want it to be. And then there's like that moment of, is he going to buy it or not, when he's just trying to back out, where suddenly like seems like businessman Elon clicks into place and is like, oh, this is a terrible mistake. This is actually a very bad business and a lot of money to pay for it. And so now he's like it seems like the focus has shifted, not just in terms of that, worrying about like speech and stuff, but also worrying in terms of like now it feels more like he's trying to save Twitter as a business, which was a separate problem that existed before. Facebook's just fired 11,000 people as well. Like a lot of social media companies are going through these difficulties as businesses. And so now he's coming in and sacking half the workforce and losing all this great talent. Like, some of the best people that aren't being sacked are getting poached by other rival companies. And like, I was reading the other day that he is trying to reassure advertisers and meet with them and tell them everything's cool. But then like two of his most senior ad execs who had these very good, well-established relationships with all the relevant people in the major, Fortune 500 companies have left the company. And so all these advertising buyers are completely spooked. And it sort of feels like, I think whatever he thought he wanted to do in the first place by buying Twitter, which seemed more like something he wanted to do for fun, has suddenly become, I'm the great businessman who's going to save this business, which is a completely different goal.
Yeah.
And I think that's part of the sort of spiral he's found himself in, of like taking on a very different task. And I mean, it's crazy to me as well. Like I saw he tweeted the other day, Twitter drives a massive number of clicks to other websites and apps, biggest click driver on the internet by far. And then there was an automated update from a community fact check effort saying the reverse is true. Twitter drives 7% of web traffic referrals. Facebook drives 74%. Pinterest drives 7%. It's very crazy to me to spend $44 billion on a company that you don't even understand fundamentally. Yeah. Like you don't even know what the company does and doesn't do. And you're spending like an insane amount of money. It just like, it reminds me of like, I'm an NBA fan, like all these teams are owned by billionaires, and like one of the teams is for sale at the moment, Phoenix Suns, which is only 2.5 billion if you want a novelty purchase, much cheaper than Twitter. But like it's not, if you're just like a business person, and all these people obviously who are really rich have been very successful in business, these are not good businesses to buy. Like they may or may not be profitable, but they're better things to invest in if you just want to make money. And these billionaires make a fortune in one field, and then they start kind of like just trying to entertain themselves with their money. But they see, like, rather than just spend all their money on like fun things to do, they seem to want to like drive themselves in a direction of taking over these like novelty businesses that like becomes more about like just wanting to be a part of something they think is cool, but then from a business perspective doesn't make a lot of sense. And yeah, I think he's sort of got himself in a corner where he doesn't really know what he wants to do and is kind of like running in every different direction, and it seems very messy.
I guess very strong vibe from Elon Musk. This is based on nothing but gut instinct, okay? So I might be wrong, but I get a very strong vibe of a guy who wasn't very popular at school, who desperately wants to be cool. I get a very strong vibe of that. Who wants to be a comedian and wants the glitterati to love him, and or the people he regards as the glitterati, some of whom are anonymous posters on Twitter. Yeah, look,
sorry.
No, I was just going to say I see him as being torn as well, and that is I see him as just loving Twitter. Like he's clearly a fan, which is great.
Yeah,
that's great that he's a fan. I mean, it's wonderful to see people who actually understand, well, sort of understand the product that they're working on. But at the same time, he's an engineer. This isn't his thing. This is a service. Twitter is a service. It's not a rocket. It involves customer service, and he's got people problems. That's one of his specific problems. I just told you the generic problem. There's specific problems as well. And I'm not going to tell you all the specific problems right now because he's got a few of them. But I'll tell you the relevant ones to what you just said, because there's a few of them there as well. Which is number one, he's terrible with people generally. okay, like a lot of engineers are and computer nerds, and like me. I'm not going to criticize. I'm not going to throw stones, but you referred to his conference call with the advertisers to try and reassure them. Well, according to Kara Swisher, during the conference call, advertisers were canceling ads during the conference call while he was trying to reassure them because he did such a bad job. And that's not his strength, right? He's not a people person. Next thing. Oh yeah, and also when the advertisers started fleeing, he started abusing them on Twitter, agreeing that he might start flaming them and naming and shaming them. What a great strategy to attract advertisers. Now, as soon as you cancel, I'm going to destroy you with my Twitter account. That's a great strategy. You also mentioned his labor management practices. They're abysmal. I mean, the fact that he fired a whole bunch of people and then had to rehire a bunch of them because he didn't know what they did before he fired them, that's not a good labor management practice. Right? Yeah, I get that he's a billionaire who gets to do whatever he likes and he treats Tesla like his fiefdom. I get that. But if you are coming into a new industry, which you don't know much about, show some humility. He showed none, which leads to the next thing, that he's incredibly arrogant. like a lot of billionaires and very successful people are. He thinks he knows best. He charges ahead with new schemes that have zero chance of working, like Twitter Blue, which we'll get to eventually. And if he only bothered to consult with anyone, he would not do that. And then he creates a chaotic environment that is poison in a customer service environment, which is what he's working in now, which isn't a rocket ship. Yeah, so that is, the other labor management thing is the fact that he told all his employees that to sign an agreement saying that they were going to work hardcore, whatever that means, before they weren't, otherwise they'd be sacked. And you go, what, all your employees? Including what, the advertising person and like the lunch lady? Like, I don't understand. Everyone's got to work hardcore regardless of, so what, is everyone just pretending to work hard now? Is that what they're doing? Even if they don't have, I mean, I get that you demand people to finish their work and to do a good job, and that might require hardcore work. I totally get that. But for him to say, you need to sign that you are going to be working hardcore, regardless of the fact you know what your job description is, just, if I'm in that environment, I think this guy is a nut. Do I want to work for a nut? You know, and the answer seems to be no. And particularly the people who are going to opt out are the people who you most want, because they're the people who have other options. Yeah, so it's so they're specific problems that are related to Elon Musk. So anyway, go on. I interrupted.
Oh yeah, I mean, just adding on the labor thing, like, I mean, he brought over people from his other companies to kind of run this process of firing half the staff. So you have people who, in like a very rapid period of time as well, because he was trying to fire everyone before they had bonuses due, which he was then told was illegal. Like, you have these people who don't know the company, like are just coming in completely blank, just like firing half the staff, not knowing what anyone does. Like, that's absolutely chaotic and obviously not going to, create a good outcome. And the whole directive of everyone has to get ready to work really hard. I mean, Silicon Valley is not exactly known as a cushy place to work already. I'm pretty sure they all already work pretty hard. Yeah. And exactly as you say, if you're someone who works at Twitter and thinks you can get a good job somewhere else, like, you're out of there. Like, no one wants to hear, like, get ready to just like work even harder at the job you're already doing for no extra incentives or you'll get fired. Like, that's a hideous workplace culture. Like, no one is going to respond positively to that, because those people are either already trying their best at their job because they care, or they're seeing this person come in, act crazy and be this like belligerent slave driver and think, I don't need this in my life. But yeah, we're talking about, Elon as a person and a manager of companies. I was doing like just a bit of general reading about him. I was mostly trying to figure out how he ended up as the richest person in the world, because that's just crazy. But, there was one like just like little little sort of tangent on him that I found funny and interesting. So I'm just going to say, but I think is also relevant because it speaks to him having a broader track record making big promises of doing visionary things when it feels like he's mostly driven by trying to entertain himself at this point. So in 2016, I don't know if you know about this, but he founded a tunneling company promising to revolutionize tunnel construction, and he called it the Boring Company, which really feels like a joke in search of a purpose.
Yes.
It's funny. I think credit to him, it's funny. But
do you reckon he came up with the name before he came up with the idea?
Yes.
Yes, I think so too.
So I was reading about the Boring Company just to try and get some sense of, to what extent this is actually a serious company that does serious things. They've done a couple of projects, but again, like his stated goal in doing this was to revolutionize tunnels and traffic and things of this nature. And I'm just going to read you this quote of Wikipedia, but please. A number of civil engineering experts and tunneling industry veterans questioned whether Musk can render tunnels more quickly and cheaply than competitors. Tunneling Journal, I'm sure a very good publication, dismissed the company as a vanity project that was inconsistent with its promised offerings. The much-hyped tunnel project constructed at the convention center in Las Vegas turned out to be a single-lane underground roadway less than a mile long, constructed at a total cost of $48 million. Musk's planned tunnels were criticized for lacking such safety features as emergency exit corridors, ventilation systems, or fire suppression. In addition, the tunnels themselves are projected to be single lane, making it impossible for vehicles to pass one another in the event of collision, mechanical failure, or other traffic obstruction, and instead would shut the entire tunnel section down. So if you just transplant that, just the whole vibe of that to Twitter, you can kind of see the roadmap of what's happening here. You're coming in, I'm a visionary, I'm going to change the whole game in this field, everything's going to be better, and really it's like cutting a bunch of corners and doing something that's really shit and not cheaper, and just like fundamentally not understanding the basic mechanics of the thing you're trying to do. Because rather than actually try to learn something, he's just so confident in his own abilities that he just thinks he can take one look at something and understand better than anyone who's been working in it for years, decades, how to do it right.
Yeah, I'm starting to regret that I assumed that he was a super excellent engineer. like I just assumed that because of the rocket stuff and the Tesla stuff. But maybe he's just really good at rockets and cars. I don't know. And that's it. Because there's some pretty fundamental engineering mistakes that you just described then. By the way, this podcast is sponsored by the Tunneling Journal from this point forward.
They do good work.
Yes, at least in spirit, if not financially. Let me throw one more specific flaw of Elon Musk, in my view, at you, because it wraps up this little section, and then we can get onto some of his ideas. He demands, and it's not unusual for a billionaire either. He demands complete control of everything, right? And that's that makes sense. If you run a successful company, you probably do want to micromanage. I get that, and that may be the reason why he's the richest person on earth. Maybe. In this case, not necessarily a good thing, at least not for his freedom agenda. And I'll tell you what I mean by that. If you really want to have a free speech system, you need to have rules, consistent rules. Now, you want to make them the minimum possible rules if you believe in free speech, if you're a free speech absolutist, but they still need to exist. You need to have some rules, right? You can't just go around just inciting murder, for instance, right? You need to have some basic rules. Okay. The more arbitrary you make moderation, the less it's actually free speech, and the more it's a patronage system for your mates. That's not free speech. And that was the exact critique of old Twitter. There was a bunch of lefties who are moderating in an unfair, opaque, and arbitrary way according to their personal biases. That was the knock. Now, you might disagree with that. You might think it was fantastic what they were doing. I'm just saying that's what Elon Musk thought, right, when he took over Twitter. So Elon Musk, he rightly decides, I'll give him credit for this, to form a content moderation council, to form some rules. That's a good thing. Apple and Google could do with that, if you ask me. Of taking it out of arbitrary moderators' hands and making it very objective and transparent. But since Elon Musk demands complete control, he has utterly ignored his content moderation council. He seems to have disappeared entirely, and he's now unilaterally unbanned people like Trump, the Babylon Bee, Jordan Peterson, Project Veritas, Andrew Tate, Kanye West, James Lindsay, Juanita Broderick, Marjorie Taylor Greene. The list goes on. They all have something in common. They're all right-wingers, which is fine. Twitter banned a lot of right-wingers. But he also unbanned Kathy Griffin after he banned her, okay? That's after he personally banned her. But the issue isn't the bias aspect of it. Like, that's not the issue for me. Like, the right-left thing, I don't care so much about that. What I care about is that the people appealed to him as some kind of Lord moderator, and then he responded. Like, righties were going, oh, how about that one? How about that one? How about that one? You go, yeah. Oh, yeah, we're saying things right. No, that's not how it's meant to work. Without any kind of system of rules in place, when you're just moderating based on your whims, it's like royalty. It's like a royal decree. That's worse than the old Twitter, because at least they had opaque rules that didn't make a lot of sense and that they didn't really stick to. He didn't seem to have any rules. It's just whatever Elon feels like. Elon Musk, is now the threat to free speech on Twitter. He personally is the threat. And so that little personal flaw of his, the demand to control everything himself, it comes out of enthusiasm. It doesn't come out of evil. It comes out of his desire to make things better by just fixing things, like a billionaire, like Trump, just doing things. But if you don't have a process and you don't have a neutral body, or someone who's not you making decisions, it just goes completely against what he's trying to do. And I think that's another problem he's got. What do you reckon?
It's also just, and it's like, I agree with that in terms of the principles of, good operation of freedom of speech. But it's also just like an astonishing waste of time. Like, I mean, it's like if I was just like tweeting at him being like, hey, Elon, I've got a problem with my Tesla. Can you fix it? Like, it's not the normal way to run a company.
It's
the
true.
CEO to individually be handling like the complaints department.
Yes.
Like, it just, I don't understand. I still don't understand how he's the richest person in the world when he seems like very unfocused as a person.
He may not be for
obviously
long.
doing something right, but I'm not sure that this is a sustainable direction for Elon or Twitter.
Yeah, let's take this up in another year or two's time, Melina. Let's see if he's the richest person in the world then. Do you have anything else to say about his general pathologies before we move on to his ideas?
No, we can move on.
Okay, all right. Now I gotta say, I might have given this implication, but I want to say it explicitly. I like the idea of Elon Musk being all Aspie and engineering focused and working 24 hours a day to try and come up with some kind of genre busting ideas. I like that. I like the bull in the china shop. I like that. I like how he clearly cares about his product. I like him rattling a lot of cages. That's great. No problems with any of that. I like him experimenting. He tweeted out, please note that Twitter will do lots of dumb things in coming months. We will keep what works and change what doesn't. I like that. But all of that only matters if what you come up with is good ideas. If all you come up with is crap ideas, then that's not going to help anyone. So let's go through some of these ideas. And let me start with some good ideas, in my view. He's had a few. I haven't seen any of them implemented yet, but he's talked a good game in terms of ideas. Like, for instance, Twitter adding attachments of long form text to tweets, so people don't have to do screenshots of notepads, which is what I do all the time. Or at least when I used to tweet, I did. Turning Twitter into a financial institution that offers payment systems and also checking facilities and higher interest rates than you can get elsewhere if you've got a positive balance with Twitter. That's a good idea. Offering ways to connect to different countries through foreign languages. Like, he cited Japan, where Twitter's really big. If they had some kind of automatic translation system, so as you type, it gets translated directly into foreign languages or something like that, that'd be awesome. He's talked about offering content producers 10% more than they get on YouTube. So there could be a bidding war for content producers who get paid nothing on the internet. That would be fantastic. So that, these are all great ideas. And by the way, I'll put in the homework the transcript of a call where he talked through all these ideas to his employees. It's quite interesting to read. But the idea that he implemented, as opposed to all of those, was his worst idea, which was the Twitter Blue idea, the worst idea ever. And this is so obviously a stupid idea. If you go back a month, you listen to our podcast, my podcast with Dr. Dave, we rubbished it before it even began, and we absolutely predicted exactly what was going to happen. It was obvious to everyone. Essentially, yeah. So Twitter, for those who don't know, Twitter Blue, they had these verification stamps before Twitter to verify if someone was real, and Musk decided to stop using them for celebrities who required verification and official people. But instead, he would use those verification stamps for people who paid $8 a month for a subscription to Twitter Blue. He thought that would incentivize subscriptions. He called it power to the people. But of course, verification performs an important function on Twitter, a very important function. It stops people impersonating celebrities and officials, and therefore makes Twitter a valuable source of reliable information from those officials and from celebrities. You can get actual quotes from them that you can use in news articles. And Twitter Blue was also going to give subscribers a search and algorithm priority. So their tweets would come up first. And when you search for stuff, you'd get theirs first, which means that the top comments and the search results would not be from the most important people and the most popular comments. It would be from people who paid $8 a month. So of course that would encourage celebrities to either stop using Twitter or to no longer verify their identities, which is where most of Twitter's value comes from. And it would secondly encourage trolls to pay $8 a month and get their trolling posts boosted and allow them to impersonate everyone else in a far more powerful fashion, which is what happened in about 5 minutes. First, there were a bunch of Elon Musk impersonators, of course. They all got banned. Elon didn't have much time for that with the free speech agenda. He then said, going forward, accounts engaged in parody must include parody in their name, not just in the bio, which would, of course, ruin the joke. So much for comedy is now legal on Twitter. That's more that specific flaw I cited in Elon Musk, by the way, that he demands personal control over everything. And then it went into hyperdrive. We got AIPAC, the Israeli lobby in America, supposedly tweeting out, "We love apartheid." Ben Shapiro supposedly tweeting out, "Matt Walsh won't stop calling me and talking about genitalia." President Biden supposedly tweeting out, "I'm over here stroking my dick. I got lotion on my dick right now." George W. Bush supposedly tweeting out, "I miss killing Iraqis." And Tony Blair supposedly replying to him with, "Same, to be honest." Eli Lilly supposedly tweeting out, "We are excited to announce insulin is free now." That crashed their stock by 5%. Nintendo supposedly tweeting out a giant picture of Mario giving an out yours sign. Tesla supposedly tweeting out, "Breaking, a second Tesla has hit the World Trade Center." That got Musk's attention again. He then said, "Any name change at all will cause temporary loss of verified checkmark." Any name change. So, and then they took the whole system down temporarily while trying to work out what the hell they're going to do. I still don't know what they're going to do with it. He experimented at some point with a different colored star for a verification of Twitter Blue, and then he aborted that within hours. What's your take on all that, Melina?
Obviously, as you said, the impersonation issue was obvious and foreseeable and seemingly a surprise to no one but him. I feel like the other big problem with Twitter Blue, though, which I feel like I haven't seen people talking about as much, and maybe because it's embarrassing for journalists and celebrities who have blue ticks to admit, but part of the value of the blue tick is not just, obviously the verification element, but it's also the status factor. Yeah. People like having the status badge of I am famous enough to have a blue tick. Yeah. And people on Twitter who don't have a blue tick get excited about the prospect of being able to interact with verified, very important people. And as soon as you can pay for that, it takes away the meaningful status element, because $8 a month is not a lot of money in the grand scheme of things. So it's like, if anyone can get it, it becomes valueless as a status symbol. And whether people who have those ticks like to admit it or not, that is, I think, a huge value and appeal to a lot of people who have blue ticks on Twitter. So he's completely undermined any kind of sense of like, part of the value of Twitter is the idea of like, there are famous people on there and you can kind of feel like maybe you end up in a conversation with them if, you get their attention, and like it's completely undermining any sense. If you democratize Twitter in that way by saying anyone can be a VIP on Twitter, it kind of means no one's a VIP on Twitter, and all the actual VIPs aren't going to want to be there anymore, which again dramatically reduces the value long term.
Can I make a point, by the way? Because since Elon Musk is so on 24 hours a day on everything to do with Twitter, he's probably watching this podcast because I'm saying it's about Twitter. So Elon, let me give you some free advice. It might be too late, but you could have made that subscription thing work with the blue ticks if you had not made it so that the only way you could get a blue tick was with $8 a month. If you kept the two streams of verification together so that the celebrities still have their blue ticks for free, the officials still have their blue ticks for free. If you want to apply for a blue tick the old-fashioned way, you can get a blue tick the old-fashioned way. But then if you don't qualify for a blue tick, you can pay $8 a month and verify your identity. Then it keeps the status. People pay $8 to get a piece of that status, and it increases the verification. It actually makes Twitter a better place. The more verification there is, the better it is. But he took away the verification element, which is the critical bit, and also took away the reason for the celebrities to keep it. So we hadn't gone all the way to the end of this journey because like on day one, it all fucked up. But the end of this journey was no celebrities having ticks and just a bunch of randos, and they're having zero status whatsoever. That was the end of the journey. So maybe it's not too late because we're nowhere near that yet. But that would be my suggestion to Elon. That's something, if you want to try something, that might work. And then you can make some money while at the same time not undermining the entire structure of Twitter. By the way, I should also say, if you want to leave that alone, which you might not want to toy with your greatest strength, there are other ways to make subscription work. You just don't mess with everyone else's user experience, which is what he was suggesting. Like the algorithm, messing with the algorithm and the boosting searches and stuff, that's a terrible idea because that makes other people not want to be on Twitter, right? What you do is, rather than making everyone else's experience worse, you make the subscribers' experience better. And this guy is supposed to be an engineer. He should be able to come up with some ways, and he's supposed to be a Twitter enthusiast. He should be able to come up with ways that you can improve people's experience. Like, here, I'll give you a couple longer tweets for subscribers. Get an extra 140 characters or whatever. Just longer tweets. Editable tweets for subscribers. I'd love that service. Special emoticons for subscribers that non-subscribers don't get. Longer videos for subscribers because the videos aren't very long on Twitter. Animated avatars for subscribers that non-subscribers don't get. Bookmarks for tweets, like a bookmarking system for tweets. That would be an interesting thing because you'd lose the tweets all the time. Look, that's just that was me sitting down for 2 minutes just trying to think of things that might improve the experience of subscribers. I'm sure Elon could come up with 100 others. That's what you do. You've got your hardcore workers. Okay, get them to implement some basic things to improve people's experience that they get if they pay $8 a month. That might work. At the very least, if it doesn't work, it won't ruin your business, which is what Twitter Blue was going to do. So that's just some free advice for you, Elon.
Yes, and if they're talking about like working with content creators, you could have like exclusive content for subscribers. Just off the top of my head.
There you go.
Also, I feel like I agree. Like, you don't make the existing service worse. You just find other ways to offer new things. If you're going to have a new thing, which is a subscription service, have a new thing to offer those subscribers. Also, I think in terms of advertising, like, I'm not like an expert in social media, but certainly my impression is like advertising does seem like least prominent on Twitter compared to other platforms.
Yeah.
Like, for example, if I'm on like Instagram and like ads come up, I'm going through stories and like full frame ads come up in between like every few stories. Like I'm very aware, and they also come up, if I'm going through the feed, and like advertising feels very prominent to me on Instagram, for better or worse. I mean, it's a worse user experience, obviously, but I would imagine that makes that advertising more valuable because it's very noticeable. Whereas Twitter, like ads on Twitter are very easy to scroll by and never like even clock what they're saying or about. And so it doesn't surprise me that Twitter is not a particularly valuable platform for ads relative to other social media platforms. And there are ways that you could improve the experience also for advertisers, I'd imagine, if you're trying to raise revenue.
Good call.
And that's the thing, like all of his like big changes are in way, like cutting costs, like, getting rid of staff and stuff, and very little in terms of like actual like decent ideas for increasing revenue. So if you're trying to save the business, like just cutting staff is like, just feels like you're just going to make the product worse. It doesn't really seem like, that's going to be sufficient without also finding a way to actually raise revenue as a company, because that's kind of an important part of running a company.
Yeah, that's a good call. The irony of the ideas, though, is that there's an excellent idea that's debuting on Twitter at the moment, which has got nothing to do with Elon. It's old Twitter that did it. The best idea going around is from old Twitter, and you've already talked about it, which was Birdwatch. The content guidelines, the fact checking through crowdsourcing, like Wikipedia style fact checking. It works. It actually works. It's fact check Elon Musk twice already, as you said. It's fact check Joe Biden. It's fact check his chief of staff. It's not biased. It's really accurate. They're good fact checks. You might not have seen it if you don't use, even if you use Twitter, because it's only been rolled out to a few people. They're just experimenting with it at the moment. But if it gets implemented properly, that could be enormous. That could totally solve the disinformation issue on Twitter for prominent tweets, without any censorship at all. Like, and it could actually make Twitter. How did he put it? I've got it down here somewhere. Twitter needs to become by far the most accurate source of information about the world. That's our mission. I don't know how he was imagining to do that with free speech, but anyway.
That's a very contradictory missions, but anyway.
Yes, but the Birdwatch, the community guidelines, that at least helps a lot. So now that's a great idea. If I was him, I'd be fast tracking that one as soon as I possibly could. Actually, I'll read you the fact check for Biden, because I quite like this. Biden tweeted out, seniors are getting the biggest increase in their social security checks in 10 years through President Biden's leadership. And the content guidelines, like almost immediately came up underneath it, saying seniors will receive a large social security benefit increase due to the annual cost of living adjustment, which is based on the inflation rate. President Nixon in 1972 signed into law automatic benefit adjustments. How good is that? If I was trying to fact check Biden, there's no way I could summarize it in 2 sentences like that. That was so good. It's a really good service. Yeah. Anyway, so there's that. Do you have any other thoughts about about Elon Musk's ideas or the content issues on Twitter? Oh, actually, next thing's going to be Trump, because that's his biggest idea, getting Trump back. But yeah, other than that, you got any other thoughts in that realm?
I mean, I am conscious that like we very much non-billionaires are lecturing a very successful billionaire on how best to run businesses. Yes. So like, I don't pretend to have the answers on how to make Twitter great myself, but it does not appear that he's doing a good job.
Look, I'm glad you said that. Yeah. I have been showing a lot of immodesty with my advice for Elon. You are right. That's correct. Some might say that I have the same issues that Elon does, about extreme arrogance. Yeah, that's fair. Okay, well, let's get on to the Trump idea, which was Elon Musk reinstating Trump after a poll, the Twitter poll, 51.8% to 48.2%. Not only is that extremely unlikely to be the reason why he let Trump on, I just don't buy that for a second, but also it emphasizes how arbitrary and subject to his royal whims Musk's moderation policy now is. Trump's still not tweeting. And when Trump was asked where he was going to go back, this is before he was brought back, he said, I don't see any reason for it. There are a lot of problems in Twitter. You see what's going on. They may or may not make it, but the problems are terrible. The engagements are negative, and you have a lot of bots and you have a lot of fake accounts. Truth Social is through the roof and doing phenomenally well. Okay. Not sure I believe the last bit. But as of now, I checked just before this podcast, Trump still hasn't tweeted. This was like probably a week since he was let back on. I mean, you can see why Musk wants him back. 65% of Trump's tweets during his term of office ended up in news stories, whereas for Obama in his second term was 3%. So it was good publicity for Twitter. But I mean, Trump's got a contract with Truth Social. He's not allowed to tweet or to post on any other social media app until 6 hours after he posts the same thing on Truth Social. So I know Trump doesn't care about contracts, but yeah, he's got money in Truth Social. He's going to lose money if he goes to Twitter. So, and yeah, he cares about money. So, and he could be sued as well because they're going public, Truth Social. And so people might be investing on the basis of Trump's contract. So if he breaks the contract, he could get sued. But, so I'm not sure he's coming, but I mean, what do you think about the idea of getting Trump back? And what do you think about what Elon Musk has done and where it's going?
Well, I mean, I don't imagine he is going to come back for the reasons you just described. Like, it doesn't seem like it's obviously it's like in Trump's interest from a publicity perspective, but people still cover what he says on Truth Social anyway. I mean, I certainly think Trump being on Twitter was bad for journalism, if nothing else. Like, I don't miss like having to hear like breathless reports every day about all the crazy things that he's tweeted. I mean, I suppose part of that's because he's not president anymore as well, but like it was like not a positive thing. Him being on Twitter, the things he tweeted, the things he encouraged via Twitter. So, I find it like hard to assess like whether I have a strong opinion about him being back on Twitter or not in a context where it's like, what is Twitter going forward anyway? Like, it's in such a state of flux, with this new regime and new principles and stuff that like, I certainly haven't missed him being on Twitter. But, I don't think it's going to end the world if he's allowed back on either.
Yeah, I must say I haven't missed not covering him on Twitter, that's for sure. I haven't missed that at all. I used to hate covering Trump tweets. In fact, I wouldn't have if it didn't irritate our viewer base. Every time I missed a Trump story, I got heaps of shit online. But I'm enjoying him not being there. But yeah, equally, I don't care. I mean, look, like Elon Musk, I am a free speech absolutist, and I think he should be there. I don't think he should have been banned in the first place. But from a governance point of view, I think he should have been suspended at the time when he was encouraging violence and a coup. But I think that enough time has passed by a mile before he could come back. Personally, I mean, I don't expect anyone to agree with me on that. That's me and my particular peccadillos. But regardless, yeah, I just don't think it really matters that much. I think he's kind of the golden era of Trump getting inside people's heads. I think is over. He still gets inside people's heads, don't worry, but not nearly as much as he used to, which is a good thing. But you say you don't think it will be the end of the world, but some people do think it's the end of the world. We're seeing quite a big response from a lot of people on Twitter. What are your thoughts about the response to Elon Musk from, in particular, the lefties, but not just the lefties, like and the media, and the response to Trump getting on? There've been some. Look, I don't have examples on me. I usually like to illustrate examples, but I didn't have time to get together. But trust me, I'm sure you won't find it difficult to believe. There have been some hysterical responses. When I say hysterical, I mean funny. I mean hysteria at the prospect of Trump coming back and what Elon Musk has done to Twitter. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I certainly don't personally feel hysterical about it. But yeah, I mean, I think like I saw an article the other day about Balenciaga leaving Twitter. I'm like, oh no, we're not going to know what handbags think of current events. Like, some of it is kind of like,
Yes.
okay, sure.
Yeah.
I am interested to see what journalists do. I think possibly the worst thing about Twitter in general is the effect that it's had on journalism, just because I think it has contributed to the dumbing down of journalism. It's not just Twitter, it's a lot of different things, but I think it hasn't helped. And I think that that's kind of, that is like a kind of a, it's one thing to have a platform where, people fight, whatever, you can say it's toxic, you don't have to be on the platform. But I think the kind of like certain elements of it have created a kind of a culture or a mindset among people in the media class who are very overrepresented in Twitter that's kind of made the media worse, which then has flow-on effects to everybody. And like, I just know like a lot of journalists, like, I mean, I remember like hearing people like Ezra Klein saying this a lot, who's like a smart guy and, sort of bemoaning, like, I don't like Twitter. I don't want to be on Twitter, but I have to be on Twitter for my work. And I just think, do you really like, do journalists need to be on Twitter to do good journalism? Like in reality, I think you get a lot of journalists talking to each other, talking to other media personalities and creating this kind of groupthink about, about issues, about, misunderstanding like where people's, like where the general public's mind is on issues. Like it just kind of, talking to each other in ways that kind of like pushes them further into a subculture that's disconnected from, reality, and that influences journalism in the way that they report on events in ways that I think are really distorting and don't do anybody any favors. And a lot of people obviously like threatening to quit Twitter if it does become, the hellscape or whatever. And I'll be interested to see, first of all, whether people actually do follow through, or at least even if they don't quit in protest, whether people start to maybe just distance themselves a little bit and maybe spend a little bit less time talking to each other on Twitter and a little bit more time actually reporting in the old-fashioned sense, like actually investigating things and talking to people and trying to find information like out in the world rather than amongst a very particular platform with a very particular kind of class of people. So yeah, I somewhat hope this could be like a positive flow-on effect from Twitter becoming worse, is maybe it will be enough to push people just a little bit away from it. And, particularly in the media class.
And there is that whole subgenre of journalism, which I know you hate, and I hate it as well, where they write an article about people on Twitter's reaction to some TV show. Like, just, Dubious 33 says, I can just go, what is this? What is this? 4 tweets, another story. But sadly, they are. So yeah, it'd be wonderful if that genre disappeared. But something tells me that, like the old, I've referred to this so many times on the podcast, The Wire, the rules from The Wire. When there's something that's terrible, it gets replaced by something that's worse. So I should be careful what we wish for. And there was a funny reaction that from CBS News. I don't know if you saw this, where I'll just play the clip. Here we go.
In light of the uncertainty around Twitter and out of an abundance of caution, CBS News is pausing its activity on the social media site as it continues to monitor the platform, Major.
So CBS News announced that they were pausing their content on Twitter as out of an abundance of caution while they monitor the site. He's going, so I don't understand. What's going to happen to the stuff you personally post? And they came back within like a day after they'd monitored the site and realized that nothing had changed much, which was quite funny. But I mean, the thing is, I find weird about this. We'll get into other aspects of this in a second, but just on a personal level, on a personal dealing with Twitter level, if you're worried about the hellscape, Twitter, unless it gets changed, is specifically designed to deal with that. You only see the people you follow, unless you look at your mentions. And if there's someone in your mentions who you hate, you block them. And in fact, the abusive ones get put down the bottom underneath the show more replies. So like they've got this little abuse section at the bottom, and they do a pretty good job, I got to say, of isolating the ones you really don't want to see, unless you click on the tab. So you don't have to. I mean, in most cases, you don't have to see anything unpleasant. If you in your timeline you're seeing lots of losers, then you're following the wrong people. Follow different people. My timeline used to be. I mean, I don't have a timeline anymore because after I got hacked, they destroyed all my followers, which I spent 10 years. So the people I was following, who I'd spent 10 years culturing, and I just thought, oh, screw it. And so I just don't use Twitter anymore because of that. But my old timeline, I would have recommended to everyone because there was no unpleasantness. It was awesome. It was just these science guys and history guys and really, really clever people. It was just the best information source ever because I wasn't following dickheads. So it's just, that's on you. If your timeline's filled with dickheads, that's on you. So it's and that's always been the case, and it'll still be the case. So I find that weird. People going, "Oh, it's such a hellscape now. I've got to get out of here." You can fix it.
A lot of people go on Twitter looking for a fight and then get mad when they find one. It's like, that's a little bit on you.
Yeah, but anyway, that's the personal side. But then people talk about more society side, which I can understand where they're coming from here. What they're talking about is, okay, Elon Musk is laying on all the dudes who are banned for misinformation and all this kind of stuff. Now, Elon Musk is of the view that Twitter was biased about what they called misinformation. They were biased against the right. I happen to agree with him on that, I must say, but other people would disagree. That's fine. We can all agree or disagree on that kind of stuff. But regardless, there are people who are saying people who shouldn't have been on Twitter because of misinformation are now back, and the Nazis are here, and the trolls are here, and all the rest of it. This, from a society point of view, is a problem. Like if there's another pandemic, then misinformation will spread efficiently. An election, there might be bullshit. I mean, look, as soon as I hear that, I think of Hunter Biden's laptop, which was censored at the last election unfairly. And you go, okay, who is going to decide what is bullshit and what isn't bullshit? Because the people in the past haven't been very good at it. And I've had people on YouTube, I'm sorry I didn't respond directly to them a few weeks back, saying how do I justify acknowledging that election deniers are awful but not wanting to censor them? Which is my position. And my position is, yes, they are awful, but someone needs to make a call about who is awful and who is not awful. And I frankly don't trust anyone. I just don't. I just see, and with good reason, from experience, that these things creep. These things start to accumulate and they start to spread. And especially when you're dealing with huge amounts of information, like it's often algorithms that determine who is misinforming and who isn't. And before you know it, people are being unfairly censored, and ideas are being censored that shouldn't be censored. And and also information changes as well. Like you have a situation like Hunter Biden's laptop is a great example. There are people who are censored for saying things that were 100% accurate about Hunter Biden's laptop, and they're still censored. And there were people who said things that were untrue, like that it was Russian disinformation, who never were censored and still aren't. So in actual fact, Twitter and social media became a tool for a tool for disinformation in itself by trying to police disinformation. So that's the reason why I am like I am. I don't think I'm creating a perfect world. Far from it. I think that the world which I imagine is an awful world, but it's the best of the possible options you have in a social media environment, with billions of tweets firing around and lots of subjective calls being made. I'm not saying don't make any calls. I'm just saying you need to be really, really, really careful about what you are banning. And you have to have very clear rules that are on the side of free speech, in my view, because of the risk of what happens when you don't. But anyway, so let's get back to these people who are worried that Twitter is going to become a hellscape of misinformation as a result of some of the people who we can all agree were putting out misinformation before they were banned. What are your thoughts on that?
I mean, like, I think it gets back to what you were saying before about like how sort of you, in terms of the censorship, like it's about incentives, people sort of reacting to rational incentives, where like you can see there is like an obvious, like say, take for example with COVID, there's an obvious public interest in wanting misinformation to not spread around vaccines, around prevention, things like that. And so you can understand like why, it might feel logical and make sense to put in like some restrictions and not, for example, like not let people post anti-vax information because that's dangerous. But then wherever you're drawing a line, whether it's there or before, or whether it's about, election voting misinformation, or it's about Hunter Biden, like it's all someone's judgment call.
Yeah.
No matter how much you feel like you're putting in some objective process, it's always going to be a judgment call, because there's infinite things that anyone could say about any topic. And like, whether you're drawing a line really restrictively or really broadly, you are always drawing a line somewhere. Even if it's no line, anyone can post anything, no matter what, no restrictions at all. That's still a line that you're drawing. It's still a judgment call that you're making. And it's still going to come down to a person or people making those decisions. And every person on the planet is flawed and not perfect in their judgment all times. So there isn't like, I don't think there is like a correct answer to the question. I think the best you can do is, again, sort of what you were saying before, of like at least being clear about what the guidelines are, so that you're getting people understand, I'm coming into a place, these are the rules. It's like if you go to like a venue and it's like you have to wear a shirt in this venue or something, like Twitter is a venue. I think if they have clear rules, you can kind of draw the line wherever you want, because then it's not about like subjectively censoring people after the fact. If you say these are the rules, this is what you're allowed to say here, and this is what you're not allowed to say here, and that is like a document that you can look at online, I think it's kind of reasonable to draw the lines wherever you want, because there's not going to be some perfect line that is going to eliminate all bad misinformation and allow all correct information and always be right. So yeah, to me, it's about the transparency more than anything. So people are all playing by the same rule book, whatever it is.
Fair enough. But the last thing I just want to say about this thing, and in fact about Twitter and Elon Musk in total, if you have anything else to say, just follow me, is that there is a group of people which I haven't talked about, which I should acknowledge. And these people I do feel genuinely sorry for if their experience is becoming shit. And that is, I'll quote Abe Greenwald on why people are freaking out so much on Twitter. Quote, people believe Twitter is the real world. They therefore believe that Elon Musk is buying the world. And I think that's a really astute observation, that's the mindset behind it. And we can mock those people. I think Abe Greenwald, I'm not sure if he was mocking those people or not. But to be fair, for some people, it is their entire world. And they're not just dickheads. Like, there are people who have been repressed in some way, who are at the wrong end of an extreme power imbalance. They live almost entirely online for whatever reason, or they're introverts. Like, these are people who have good reason to spend an inordinate amount of their time on Twitter. And if their life is ruined because of the whims of a billionaire, I feel sorry for those people. Like, and it's okay for me to say, oh, I just changed your timeline. But the more time you spend on Twitter, the harder it is to control, to stop things coming your way that you don't want to see. And I accept that, and I agree with that. And none of my solutions apply to those people. And I do feel sorry for them. I just want to just acknowledge that those people are getting fucked up, and that's a shame. I mean, what do not just your thoughts on that, but anything to do with Twitter before we move on?
No, that's a very empathetic perspective, and nice of you to make the time to point out.
Sure. Okay. I know you wanted to talk about polling. It's surprising that someone else wants to talk about polling other than me. I'm done with polling, but you got something to say. So why don't you tell us about it?
Yeah, well, I think like I wanted to talk about it today because I feel like I've seen you and many other people, but talk about the problems with polling at the moment, on the podcast, on the shows and stuff. A lot of people at the moment talking about how there are major problems with the conducting of polls, getting accurate polls. we don't need to rehash all that again, but broadly, like just, the difficulty of getting people's responses and therefore, and, different groups just not answering the phone or groups deliberately avoiding polls, various things that are making it very hard to get accurate samples and people kind of hand wringing over, this is an issue, and I sort of think like I've noticed a lot of coverage in that vein. And what kind of interests me about it is that it tends to take for granted that polling is good. That polling is important and a part of the political process that we need. And so therefore we need accurate polls, and therefore we should all be worried about the lack of accurate polls. And it's taken for granted that they're useful and good. And I just was kind of thinking about it. I'm like, are they? Like, I didn't necessarily come to that with a fixed position. I mean, I think, I like many people bemoan, the influence of polls on politics, but that's sort of different to whether we should have them at all or not. And I sort of thought, it was worth actually, I was curious in your opinion on it, and I'm sort of interested to sort of do a bit of thinking and reading about it as well, to kind of just actually like step back and think like, why do we have polls? Why are they useful? Are they useful? And, if we're like thinking about the perfect world we would wish for, would we wish for polls to be better, or would we wish for there to be no polls, and why? So in thinking that through, I was sort of thinking broadly, first of all, like what are polls actually used for? Because they're used for a lot of different things. Obviously, politicians use them to target their campaigning, for, figuring out their policies and for governing. Media use it for coverage, especially for predictions of elections, what's going to happen, but also people's opinions on policies as they're being debated or campaigned on. It's used for debate eligibility in the States, particularly in primaries. People often have to clear a certain threshold of polls to be able to be on a debate stage. They're also used in betting markets and other various things as well. A little bit of a side note before getting into the arguments for and against. As I was sort of doing some reading, came across this article. It's a New Yorker article from 2015 that actually went into the history of polling, like how kind of modern polling came about, which was kind of interesting. So I'll kind of give the summary version here, and then if people are interested, they can look at the whole article.
We'll put in the notes.
So in terms of sort of history of modern polling, there was originally a time when newspapers in the States would print ballots that you'd cut out and take to the polling station to actually vote. This was the sort of old school system. And around the 1880s, so these would be real ballots. And then around the 1880s, the government introduced a secret ballot, and the government began supplying ballots as part of that process to polling stations. But newspapers kept printing these ballots and encouraging people to send them to the newspapers as these sort of straw polls to kind of get a bit of like, effectively as they use today, to predict how people were going to vote. And this is obviously not scientific. It was just content. It was just ways for newspapers to, do that classic like horse race content of who's going to win the election. Like, let's speculate. Then in the 1930s, a man called George Gallup, from that Gallup, he originally wanted to be a newspaper editor, but he ended up doing a PhD program in applied psychology. And he wanted to create like some more scientific methods for measuring public opinion. And it originally, again, in sort of this mix between politics and content from a newspaper's perspective, in his PhD dissertation, he got people to mark the parts of a newspaper that they liked as a way to advise editors which parts they should keep and which parts they should cut. So his kind of like original driving force was about making the news entertaining, which I think is a sort of interesting flavor to, what was to come. But then like newspapers like increasingly would do these kinds of straw polls. They'd get like readers, newspapers all around the country would get readers to write in with who they were going to vote for, so they could publish these polls ahead of election day. And George Gallup recognized that these were not representative. So he created what was called the American Institute of Public Opinion, which was funded by newspapers and sought to use statistical methods to get a better prediction of what people felt about issues in particular. The main innovation being using a representative sample to try and get a sort of a non-skewed picture of where people's heads were at with issues, political issues. So even though he started out with a kind of motivation of making the news more entertaining, he pretty quickly started making like a moral argument around polling and saying that polling enhanced democracy. And a quote from him was, "We need to know the will of the people at all times." So this was the sort of new driving motivation of why we needed polling and what it was for. Having said that, in the South, where Black people were generally prevented from voting at that time, they deliberately didn't sample Black people because they were considered not part of the electorate and therefore not people that they should represent in their representative polling. And, you know, the critique obviously of that people make is that you're actually like compounding problems rather than improving democracy, because very quickly it's moving from we just want to know what people think to we're trying to predict the electorate, which is a different question. Interesting also, he was not a fan of using polls for election predictions. He wanted to use them more on issues because he didn't think it served a social purpose to try and predict who would win an election.
He's right.
He's right, but they did it anyway. Only to prove the accuracy of their polls. And then, having said that, he very famously missed. He predicted in the 1948 election that Dewey would beat Truman, and Truman won by 4.5 points. So they, from a very early point, were doing this sort of prediction polling just to prove how right they were, and they weren't right. So, but it's kind of interesting. I think learning about that background, because it's always been an open and vexed question, like what polls are for and who polls are for, and how accurate or scientific they are in terms of measure, you know, what they're trying to measure, what they should be trying to measure. Can you actually get a scientific measure of people's opinions? Is that actually a realistic goal? These are kinds of things that from the very beginning of polling, people were trying to establish. And I think it's sort of still an open question. So to me, like, it is like a big question of, do we want polls to represent the people or voters? Because they're very different goals. Like turnout in the US in the midterms was 47%. So the electorate is very different to the population. And I think it's a valid question because it dictates, you know, what the goal of polling is in terms of, do we want to know what people think so that we can like represent all people, or are we just trying to find out what people think because we want to know who's going to win an election, and politicians want to try and win the election by targeting people that are actually going to vote. Also, I think worth sort of making the distinction between politicians and the media, because both use polls a lot and they're different things. You know, it makes sense that it's in a politician's interest to try and get good quality polling because they're trying to win an election, especially in a place like the States where you have voluntary voting. A lot of that is about targeting people and trying to get people out. It's a totally different question whether it serves a useful purpose for the media to be reporting on polls. Like, is that actually, I understand that it's a tool for political strategists, but is it actually useful information for the media to be reporting on, which they obviously do frequently, and they conduct polls themselves as well. And I think, you know, it's not, we shouldn't just take for granted that that is actually a good thing. Having said that, I think I'm sort of keen to rattle through some arguments in favor of polling and some arguments against, and you can jump in with any of your thoughts. Do you have any sort of overall thoughts?
I guess I would distinguish between, and you've already made this distinction, but I think we should emphasize it, the distinction between academic polling and media polling. And I include politicians polling as academic polling, as in polling for some kind of knowledge purpose versus polling for entertainment. And media polling is exclusively for entertainment, let's face it. Like it's, that is definitely the case. I think there's no greater public good out of media polling. They're polling in the newspapers, but polling from universities and by politicians to try and ascertain what people think in order to draw some conclusion with their particular activities and what they're studying, then I think that's a completely different kettle of fish. I actually think that we can make one more distinction between the politicians polling and the academics polling, because I think any political polling of any kind, whether it's issue polling or party polling or election polling, whatever, is influenced by the most powerful force on earth, as far as I'm concerned. More powerful than gravity, more powerful than nuclear fission. It's partisanship, and that partisanship just when a person thinks they know what their political group would advise them to say when they hear a polling question, I think they are far too influenced by giving the answer they think they're supposed to give, either from the little voice in their head saying, "Oh yeah, you're on this side, you should say this," or to either confirm or retaliate against what they think the interviewer wants them to say. Either way, I think it's just there's far too much murkiness introduced by those factors for it to be useful at all. Like you just don't know at all. Whereas academic polling is about something completely different. It's about something you've never thought of. You'll hear a question that's the first time you've ever heard it. It's about something you don't think about at all. There's a pretty good chance you might give an honest response. Whereas I think that isn't influenced by other factors. So I think academic polling is much more likely to be accurate than political polling for that reason. And I think it's therefore much more likely to be useful as well. So that's my main distinction. But then I've got, unsurprisingly, a lot of thoughts about media polling, which is the one I know most about. But I'll save them till after you've done your pros and cons, I think. So,
and we should distinguish between those things, that we are talking about political polling and media polling and not the academic kind, because obviously like the census is also like technically a poll, but very different in its goals and execution. So we're looking at this like specifically through the political lens and that kind of research and that kind of polling. So I think start with some of the arguments in favor of polling, be fair to polls and the people who use them. I think, look, I'm not a political operative. I'm sure that they would have, if we asked people who live and work in that world, would have more to say on this. But in terms of what I can imagine, there's people who would defend polls would say it's good about them and useful about them. I think one argument that they would probably make is that it has the potential to enhance responsiveness to constituents. So, I'm sure that they would argue it's the most effective way for politicians and the media to understand how people are thinking between elections. Like obviously, like every 2, 4 years, 6 years, depending on which chamber there is an election, we find out what people think then. But, so they would say it's better for them to not be flying blind in between and to have a sense of what's popular, what's not popular, and to try and reflect that in their actions. It's obviously in their interest to be re-elected, but I think that they would argue that they're also doing what they're supposed to be doing by trying to get a gauge of what people want them to do and trying to be responsive to that. And the most effective and efficient way to do that between elections is through polling. I think also, you can see some examples where you could use it as if it is representative to reveal issues to specific groups. So as one historical example, I also came across this article in 1960, the DNC hired a company at the Democratic National Committee, hired a company that analyzed historical polling data, and they found they'd lost 1% of the vote in key northern states because there had been a shift from parts of the Black population to Republicans. And it thought that influenced them to add the civil rights paragraphs to their party platform that year. So they had a sense of a small movement that's hard to kind of identify. And, they identified that through polling and issues polling and, adjusted their platform accordingly. And I think the other main argument people would make is it is just one tool. Like politicians and the media use many tools to measure public opinion, like focus groups and in-person interviews, conversations with people, feedback through local staffers, and there's nothing wrong with trying to measure and quantify public opinion as long as the limitations of that data are well understood. And they would, I'm sure, argue that they do understand those limitations and it's just one input among many. And, you have people like organizations like 538, who their whole thing is about polling. And I'm sure that they would argue that their work is geared around contextualizing polls so that you can use that information usefully along with other reporting and other kind of, helping people understand like the limitations of that data so that it can be used to the extent of its usefulness. And I do think that that's reasonable. Yeah.
Although we should say there that, and the 538, as soon as you mention them, that's the first thing I think of is that it's one thing for them to understand, it's nothing for their readers to understand, because they go out of their way to explain in detail the limitations of their polling and what it means, and no one takes it in. People clearly don't read that article. They just look at the graph and they look at the number at the end, and 538 still gets crap about getting the 2016 election wrong when they said that Clinton had I think it was 71% chance of success, which means that she had a 30% chance of not winning the election. And they were emphasizing that 30% is a very decent chance. And so they didn't, in inverted commas, get it wrong. But people are idiots and they just don't understand probabilities, and they just say, are they going to win or are they going to win? And that's it. That's all they process. So it's frustrating that no matter how hard people try to contextualize and explain, that a very large proportion of the audience for those explanations are just not going to get it. That's media polling, I understand. Anyway, so be you going.
No, I agree. Like, I think that's the counter argument to it just being one tool argument is like, it's probably no problem with polling if it is used with a strong understanding of its limitations, and it is used as one small tool among many to gauge public sentiment. But like, I think that a lot of people do misuse it, like a lot of prominent, powerful people in the media and politics. And so whether it's realistic that it's used accurately and correctly in a way that makes it useful, or whether it's ultimately used in a way that's not useful, I think is an open question. Do you have any other arguments you'd like to make in favor of polling?
As you'll hear when I say what I have to say, it's not really in favor or against. It's more just a recognition of the sad reality in which we live. So you keep going. I'm not gonna give either pro or con.
Okay. Well, let's get to some of the arguments against, or at least questions that I have raised with myself as I've been thinking about this, that I'm interested in your thoughts on. So, I think one question I have about the usefulness of it is whether it really does connect politicians to the public, or if it actually creates distance in practice. Because I sort of think is looking at like a report with numbers about what people think on this or that, is that really just kind of a way to avoid the more time consuming and awkward option of dealing with the public and like going to a town hall meeting, for example? You can probably also get a pretty good flavor of what people care about, but it's way more of a pain in the ass, and it's way more awkward and uncomfortable and time consuming than looking at some data on a page. Are we actually getting a more responsive politician in practice, or is that just kind of distancing people from their constituents through data and reporting and many layers of information and research gathering?
I reckon my experience, and this is only my experience, suggests that when you give people a choice between taking the easy way to get information and the hard way to get information, and they consistently pick the easy way, when you take away the easy way, they don't opt for the hard way, they go for no information. So that's what I'd say. I would say that, if we live in a world where politicians feel they only have the time to take in polls, they're not going to suddenly talk to their constituents when those polls are taken away. They're just going to make assumptions, and they will start taking anecdotal data instead of polling data. Like, so and so said this and so said that, and I got a letter from X. That's my gut instinct, but I'm a cynic.
Yeah, well, I mean, that kind of gets back to relying on the idea that polling is an accurate measure of sentiment and public opinion, which if it is, then it is way more efficient and it makes sense. But if it's not, then it's sort of a bit of a potential red herring. But whether that it is an attempt to improve on what came before, which was also no reason to think it was an accurate cross-section. Obviously the people who show up to a town hall meeting is not a representative sample either. So, it's one of those things where there isn't an obvious answer on the best way to do it. But another argument which people make is that it's majoritarian inherently to have polling and a focus on polling, whether we want politicians to follow what the majority of public opinion is, or if we want them as professionals to have a greater understanding of issues and try to persuade their constituents that they're making good decision rather than following the sort of supposed public majority will from a poll. The counter argument to that is, as I said before, it can help identify not just majority opinion, but strongly held minority positions that, might end up ultimately being reflected as well. So I don't necessarily agree with, I mean, the people who make that argument, and I don't necessarily agree that it's inherently majoritarian and will always result in people just wanting to go with whatever 51% of people think, because as we know, especially in the US, like smaller minority groups, not just, I mean, it can be minorities from a racial perspective, but also minority interest groups in terms of, for example, like people who believe strongly in gun rights or, you know, very anti-abortion. They're not necessarily majority opinions, but polling demonstrate, as also lived experience through elections demonstrates for decades, that that's a strongly held view. So yeah, I'm not actually persuaded by the idea that it's necessarily only a majoritarian thing, but that is one of the arguments that people make against it.
Yeah, I'm with you. I reckon that you can still be a leader, leading people while knowing where they stand. I think it's still useful information to know, especially if you can know that you want to lead people in a direction they don't want to go, then you will lead them in a different way. You will reach out more. You'll be more consultative. You'll be more considerate, more patient. Then if you think to yourself, oh, 87% of people agree with me, then you'll just proceed on a formality basis. Whereas if you think I'm trying to argue here against 75% of the public, you will try to persuade them more. So I think it's even if you do want to go against the majority, good polling is useful to tell you how to lead them in a different direction, I think. Now, for those who are wondering why all of a sudden Melina is wearing new clothes, it's because we are recording this the day after. This is now Friday. I know I'm putting this up on Sunday, hopefully, but this was recorded on Friday now, whereas the first part was recorded on Thursday. I'll tell you why, and a little bit extra about that after Melina finishes making her point, because I don't want to interrupt the flow too much. We've already waited 24 hours. I can't wait to hear the end of the list of cons about polling. So, Melina, keep on going.
Yes, so we were going through the points against polling, and next one we had was the question of, does it dumb politics down, the use of polls, the way that we use them today? I think one of the arguments in favor of that criticism is that polls have to reduce issues to single lines. So if you're taking potentially like a very complicated issue and you're trying to distill it into a question with a sort of short multiple choice answer, it removes the nuance of political issues so that it can sort people into just a handful of positions in an efficient way. And if politicians and the media take their cues from the post-sorting data, are we encouraging them to deal in simplistic sound bites rather than reflecting the nuance of public opinion back to us? Are we actually kind of telling them our opinions in sound bites? And so that kind of reduces their political rhetoric into these sort of small little sort of chunks of opinion. And I think like in that sense, it's sort of like, I think we do see evidence of that happening, and it's kind of no wonder that election outcomes are increasingly mystifying to politicians, because like you just take like, a big talking point and lead up to the midterms was people being really concerned about inflation. But I mean, if you ask me, like, am I concerned about inflation? Like, yes, I am. Things are noticeably more expensive. That concerns me. I don't like everything being more expensive all of a sudden, and I'm not, for no extra benefit. But like, does that tell you anything about how I'm going to vote? Like, why would it? It just affects everybody, really. And I think people draw like excessive conclusions from these sort of like very reductive questions. And also I think encourages politicians to target their messaging in really specific ways, because they're getting so much of their data from these very refined talking points. And I think the other problem with that is that it disincentivizes persuasion, because it flattens issues and people's opinions on them into these neatly defined categories, which ignores the fact that most people's opinions on most issues are fluid and open to argument to different margins. So if you sort of think, well, 30% of the population is against that, it's like, are they against that, or did they have to pick a category to be sort of efficiently sorted into these sort of barrels of opinion? But it reduces people to these sort of categories that seem more fixed than they actually are, which potentially misleads politicians and the media into thinking that things are more set than they are, and then operating under those assumptions when they don't necessarily need to.
Yeah, because of course it's impossible to poll someone for whether they're persuadable. I mean, that's an impossible thing to measure. And so I definitely see a point. The other thing I would add to that, which I think is another con, is actually, it's kind of a 2-in-1 con, that the wording is so important with polls. It's really, really, really easy to be misleading in assessing people's viewpoints based on the wording. And if you are finicky enough with your wording and nuance, you can actually isolate exactly in a reasonable way exactly what they think about a particular thing. It will only be a very, very specific element of that thing. It takes a lot of working with the wording to isolate the exact nuance that you're going for, which means that you're missing the rest of the forest. You're just isolating one tree. And I think it has a tendency to simplify people's points of view by focusing on one tree, and then people generalize the rest of the forest when they have no reason to do so based on that poll.
Yes, and when you have these sort of broad questions, it's open to interpretation as well. I mean, you see that all the time in, like, pollsters in the States often ask questions about, you know, are you worried about threats to democracy? And you see a really high yes response rate to that among Democrats and Republicans. Obviously, Democrats and Republicans are interpreting that question entirely different ways. Their perception of what is a threat to democracy is different. So what does it mean? I mean, it tells you something about a general institutional mistrust, but it's not, if you have like a bunch of people interpreting a question in different ways, what does it tell you if a certain percent agree or disagree with that particular statement? I also wonder if, you know, it's a way to, you know, one of the arguments in favor that we were talking about before is that it's a way to track public opinion between elections. But I wonder if that kind of incentivizes the kind of permanent campaigning mode that we tend to get these days, where you get the sense that politicians are, you know, and it happens in Australia too, like just relentlessly on a campaign footing, rather than what, you know, you could argue is preferable of, you have your campaign, you win your election, and then you're in governing mode, which is a very different thing. It's a very different set of behaviors, set of incentives, you know, very different focus. And, you know, you kind of, I think, in an ideal world would want politicians governing between elections. But, you know, if you kind of have these policies sort of reduced to these very simplistic categorizations, I think, you know, the kind of incentive to win the media cycle, it gears everything towards these kind of like snappy, reductive categories, rather than, you know, dealing in the sort of full nuance and complexity of actual policy, which is what you would want from people in a governing state.
Yes, it is.
Yeah. No, you.
No, I was about to give a more going down a different road when it came to polls. So if you still got more on your list of cons, do the list of cons.
Sure. Well, I mean, I was also, you know, we sort of talked before about distinguishing between how politicians use polls and how the media uses polls. And I also think it's worth questioning, does it dumb down media coverage? And is there any reason for media to give so much?
It'd be pretty dumb to dumb down media coverage.
Well, it's these things have been happening for a while, as you know, since, you know, the 30s, really. We've sort of had modern polling. So these are long-term trends. Yeah. But, you know, the media being in the polling game, I think, does focus them on horse race political coverage rather than issues, which is to the detriment, I think, of coverage. You know, I don't think it adds really any value to the political process to have like hordes of media speculating on who might win elections. That doesn't tell you anything you need to know. It's something that might happen, not something that has happened. We've talked about this before. You know, it's a lot easier and therefore cheaper and cost effective to speculate about things that might happen if you're in the news, if you're a journalist, than it is to figure out what did happen and report on it. And that's why all the incentives of the modern news, where journalists are under more pressure than ever to do more with less, pushes everyone increasingly towards this kind of speculation-oriented news coverage. But it doesn't add any value, I don't think, to the political discourse at all. It doesn't do anything to hold politicians to account. It doesn't do anything to help inform voters about the direction of the country or how they might want to vote and what way of voting would best benefit them as voters. And I think that polling is obviously just one part of that picture. There's a lot of complex factors at work there, but I do think it's a focal point of that kind of coverage and the kind of scientific framework around it in some ways validates it as a thing to be covered, because there's this sense of polling as this objective thing that's happened. So I think the news and the people making decisions about coverage, it feels more legitimate as a thing to cover if it has this sort of aura of science around it.
Now, this links to what I wanted to talk about. So I will come off this. This was going to be my general point about, so my general cynical point about that media-driven polls. And that is that when you're having an argument about something subjective, like politics or tactics, that kind of thing, there's only two ways you can argue. One is with assertion and one is with evidence. Now, assertion isn't very effective or interesting. To just say, I'm right and you're wrong, that's it. That's not very interesting, and it doesn't fill up much airtime or column inches as well. And so the media don't like that. Evidence is much more useful, I feel, even if that evidence is an illusion, hypothetically speaking. Now, there are two kinds of evidence. There is using history to find relevant parallels in the past, and then draw an analogy to today, adjust them a little bit because today's different, but then say, okay, we're learning from history, this happened, but this is a little bit different, so let's look at another point in history when that happened, and then put them all together to have some kind of validation of your point of view based on history, right? But that is very time consuming to do the research. It's very hard to do the research. It takes a lot of brains, certainly more brains than most journalists have. And so, and most pundits, I might add. But you don't need to become a historian if you have a poll, because that cuts out the middleman. Rather than finding a parallel to guesstimate how people would react to an occurrence, you can just ask them and find out and go, there, I don't care what happened in history, because this is what's happening now. We don't need to estimate. We know. Here is the science. There. That's what's happening. And that's fast, it's easy, even a journalist can understand it. And that is why we're addicted to polls, because it is the easiest, simplest way to act like you have evidence to when you're constructing an argument about a subjective thing. And that is why, in my view, they are never going to go away, no matter how compromised and inaccurate they are, because the alternative is to become a historian, and journalists aren't going to do that. So it creates content and it saves us time, and that is the bottom line. So that's the reason why I think polls are beloved by journalists and the media so much. It's a replacement for history.
The polls are getting worse, but the coverage of them is increasing all the time, yes. Which is not a rational set of directions for things to be going in. But and given how divided the US in particular is at the moment, I question what a poll can tell you about how people feel about an issue that you couldn't get equally accurate by just interviewing a couple of dozen people and asking their opinions, and then just splitting it 50-50 as a journalist and say, some people think this, some people think that, but it has this sort of, polls have this veneer of scientific rigor that Talking People doesn't, that I think, and then it's also obviously, way faster and easier for journalists, not for pollsters. It's very hard for pollsters to get that information, but much easier for journalists to cover a poll than to do that on the ground reporting themselves. But that is the sort of last area I wanted to talk about in terms of polls, that idea of our pollsters going to a lot of trouble to make something scientific that isn't really scientific, which is people's opinions, which is this amorphous blobby thing that is constantly subject to change and involves many different people with many different interests and focuses and inputs in their lives, and reducing that to a set of numbers. I feel like the media in particular and politicians have taken for granted for decades that that's achievable, and I'm not sure that it was ever achievable, even when polls were much better. Obviously it can tell you something, but there are things like, is there an observer effect where, if a poll takes a representative sample of people, does polling someone's opinion on something change it? Because people are being asked their opinion in the context of a stranger coming from a, purported scientific institution or organization, asking your opinion on the phone about a political issue. Is that the same answer you would give versus if you were talking about something with your mates or at your work? People's opinions can change depending on the context. It also assumes people have opinions on something. Most people don't have thought through opinions on most issues. Like, obviously there are like big picture issues. You know, you might be like pro or anti-abortion, for example. You probably have some opinion on that, but you don't necessarily have a very considered opinion on the specifics of an issue. Or you might be sort of pro or anti-gun control, but again, the specifics of, you know, what gun control, what laws, which places. And then when you get to something like inflation, do most people have a considered opinion on how to fix the issue of inflation? It's a very complicated issue. I think most politicians probably don't have a good opinion on that. And ask just, you know, people, I mean, we both know this from making television, people are very accommodating and want to be helpful. And if you ask people for an opinion, they'll try to give you one generally, but it's not necessarily like they're, you know, and I don't mean this in a condescending way, but like it's not necessarily something people have thought about before, but like people are good natured and want to be helpful. And so they'll probably tell you something if you ask them their opinion. But, you know, is it actually a fixed, considered opinion in the way it will appear to be in a published poll?
I would take it even further. And I would say that part of the problem is that the polls inform people of what their opinions should be.
Yeah.
You haven't thought about a question at all, and you see a poll that says 88% of people think X, you think to yourself, well, I should probably think X. Like, and so I actually think it's there's a bit of chicken and egg there with polls and people's opinions, which is, yeah.
And also, like, it frames something as a political issue. Like, so for example, if you ask about inflation, it's kind of up for debate whether that is a political issue, right? Whether it's politicians causing high inflation, whether they can do much about it. But by asking about it in a political poll, you inherently frame it as a political issue,
totally,
in a way that people might not have considered it in the absence of that. And so I think in one sense, like, is it kind of misleading to say that it is a public opinion on something when we don't necessarily have the tools to measure it? And I also think you touched on this a little bit before, but, you know, polls are kind of seen as objective, but they're still heavily dependent on the judgment of the people running them, as, you know, in terms of what they're asking, how they ask them, the framing of questions is incredibly important to the outcome. And it's as influential as a newspaper editor making decisions about what to cover or who to talk to or who to quote. Like, there's no sort of like neutral question that, or neutral, you know, in terms of the wording of the question or which questions or topics to even cover. There's no neutrality in that, but it's still people making decisions, and there's still editorial judgment in that, which is fine. But I don't think that it's fine if people understand that. But again, you know, whether people in the media and politics who rely on these polls understand that in the way that they then react to that information and use that information to inform their choices, I'm not so sure.
Yeah, sure. By the way, I was just thinking an example of what I was just talking about, of where the poll can actually create opinion. I feel like there are two, look, I wouldn't say they're proven, they're not proven, this is my opinion, but two cases where I suspect we have seen exactly that phenomenon in society in the last few years are legalizing marijuana and same-sex marriage, where both of them had an explosion over a brief period of time of support. And I think part of that was the momentum they achieved by an increase in the polls, which especially when it comes to something like same-sex marriage, where there's bigotry on the agenda, where the argument the argument against the people being anti-gay marriage is you are a bigot. It's very harder to run the argument you are a bigot when 20% of people support same-sex marriage than it is when 75% of people support same-sex marriage. And so I actually feel like the polls itself have influenced the outcomes of that debate, which, you know, if you're on the side of the majority on both those questions, which I happen to be, and I think you are as well, then that's great. But that's not what the role of polls are meant to be. They're not meant to be push polls. They're meant to actually reflect the people's opinion. So yeah, it's just an interesting little aside. What I was going to say was that I've been trying to think of what the alternative is, because, yeah, if you take my cynical view that this is a necessary part of coverage because it's just so much easier than the alternative, then they're going to stay there until they're replaced by something else that performs the same role. And you have detailed a number of issues. Like, I know you're not coming down one side or the other. You're just talking about the pros and the cons. But I mean, it's pretty clear looking at your list that the cons are heavier than the pros. So I'm just thinking, what is an alternative? And look, I haven't come up with one, but I was just thinking, you want to invent something, some other way of providing evidence for arguments that doesn't have the same precision, the faux precision of polls, like that's to a percent, sometimes to 1/10%, I think is part of the problem. You want to remove that faux precision, but at the same time be informative in some way to aid an argument. And I was thinking that if you work on panels, like focus groups, not just in terms of like a poll type focus group, but in we take a focus group where we see these kinds of personalities and then we expose them to this kind of information and then they say X. That gives you information on, it's like an experiment almost. If you conduct a social experiment with various types of people, that gives you information of how the greater community might react to a broader example of that kind of stuff. Now, that does not give you 34% of people are going to do this. That does give you look, if we as a society are in this area and then we're exposed to that kind of ad, we then react that way. Listen to the people. And so it doesn't have the precision, but it potentially has the argumentative value of example. If you conduct it, once again, like polls, a focus group experiment is going to be reliant on the quality of the experiment in terms of the value you get from it. And if people start doing this, it would inevitably become really shit really fast because they'd be cutting corners and there'll be journalists running them and not scientists running them and all the rest of it. I acknowledge that, but that form may be what eventually at least supplements, if not replaces, the current poll. Slightly more expensive, although as time goes on, polls are becoming more expensive because they're harder to conduct. So there might be a time when the focus groups are actually cheaper.
And politicians do them now. And I mean, that was a bit of a story point in the recent midterms where Democrats, people running the campaigns were doing focus groups where they found, there was questioning based on the polls on whether the Democrats' strategy was going hard on abortion and democracy, threats to democracy, was working, because the polls were suggesting that it was not working, and people were like, they screwed it up. And they seemed like quite confident because there were people doing focus groups finding that those messages were resonating in those groups. Yeah. And to a large extent, they were right. I mean, obviously it was a mixed result in the election, but they were picking up something in terms of, people's reactions to that messaging that the polls were not picking up. But that's, I think if you threw out polls and just had focus groups, I'm sure you'd get the same problems where it's sort of, people just kind of over relying on one data set. And, probably in an ideal world, like you said, there's nothing inherently bad about polls if you understand their limitations and you use them accordingly as a mix of things. And it's just a data point. And like, they do tell you stuff. It's not like they like completely bullshit and don't tell you anything about anything. Like they obviously measure something. It's just, I think being aware and, as we talked about before, like the 538 people, like they probably spend more time thinking about this stuff than anyone in the media. And subsequently, they're usually the most cautious in terms of actually projecting things and making conclusions about, predicting election races in particular. And that usually reflects pretty well on them because the people who do just sort of leap to conclusions tend to be wrong, especially lately. So, I think that they are a good demonstration of how you can, like, you don't have to ignore polls or say that they're all trash and never pay any attention to them. But like the people who pay attention to them the most are generally the first to tell you shouldn't pay too much attention to them.
That is true. Now, we should move on because you have kindly allowed me to throw at you a couple of things I couldn't squeeze into the previous podcast, and I'm desperate to get in before we wrap up with this. This is the final podcast of 2022. Before we do that, very quickly, Stats Nugget. This is the Stats Nugget I've been trying to cram in for ages, and I'm finally going to get in. This is another Kevin Drum special. So many of my Stats Nuggets come from Kevin Drum. All he does is just pump out stats and graphs all day. I love the guy. Anyway, he has a bit of a bit of a bee in his bonnet about millennials, and you're a millennial, so I'd love to throw you. When I say he's got a bee in his bonnet about millennials, he doesn't have a problem with millennials. He thinks that people going on about how tough millennials have it is a bit of. He thinks that's a bit of a media beat up. He says, yeah, like things haven't really changed that much when you look at the stats. Things are quite similar to what they've always been. As much as the media would suggest otherwise. And he put out a bunch of graphs, which I am going to show. You won't see these, but the people at home will see them if you have a look, and they'll be in the homework as well. So then you can see afterwards if you want. But, I'll just run through them quickly. Wealth per capita. You can see on the curve, millennials are now matching boomers and Generation X's at exactly the same age for wealth per capita. From the Federal Reserve Survey of Consumer Finances, he's measured the gap between wealth and wealth expectations from polling of what people feel like they should be. And in 2010, millennials were about 48% behind where they expected to be. In 2013, they were 55% behind where they expected to be. In 2016, they were 40% behind where they expected to be. In 2019, they were 11% behind where they expected to be. So there's a big catch up happening when people were old enough to start accumulating wealth and income, which is of course what happens when you're young. You don't have as much income. You're paying either off a house or whatever, or your student debt or whatever. And then when you start earning some money, it's not so bad. Talking about income, median annual income is from the census, adjusted for inflation. Back when baby boomers turned 30 to when millennials turned 30, they have gone up from $34,000 a year to $42,000 a year. That's adjusted for inflation. Okay, that's important. Although the millennials are only a touch higher than the X's were. There hasn't been much increase since the X's turned 30 in income, like as of last year, I think that was. Census Bureau again, because the first thing you think of is whenever you compare millennials to previous eras is homes and mortgages and how expensive property is, especially if you happen to come from Sydney, you think about. But this is the bit which I was really surprised by. The median monthly mortgage payment actually fell a little bit between when boomers turned 30 to when millennials turned 30, adjusted for inflation. But this year, it's skyrocketed. That's the difference. Like this year, the mortgage rates have gone through the roof. Now, hopefully that's temporary. But before this year, they're actually better off when it came to monthly mortgage repayments than they were under the boomers, which was a real surprise to me. And there's a bunch of other graphs there as well. So I'll put it in the homework if you're interested. But the basic takeaway, according to Kevin Drum at least, and he's pretty good at this stuff, is that there was a gap. There was a big gap. It was after the GFC. And that's what what everyone was focusing on. They're going, oh my God, look how awful things are for youngsters. And yeah, after the GFC, a lot of things were awful. But then when things started to catch up in the later Obama years and under the Trump years, and income's going up now again, the gap has been filled, which is, that's encouraging news. As the representative millennial, do you have anything to say about this one?
The one thing I wondered is with the housing prices, have the prices gone like up to pre-GFC levels, or is it partly attributable to the housing prices crashing around that time in terms of it being cheaper for a stretch compared to boomers?
You can't see the graph, but it doesn't go up and down as much as you might think. It's recall that monthly mortgage repayments are probably more depend on interest rates than they are on the relative prices of houses. I mean, a house can go up or down $100,000, which is a lot of money, but the interest rate makes so much bigger a difference on what you pay. And so I think the fact that they're being very low interest rates for a very long time probably helps. I would suggest. But anyway, enough of that one. Let's go. I'm just racing along because I've got my eye on the clock. As always. And by the way, I did say I'd explain what was going on. Where both Melina and I had to go yesterday, and I had to sort out Bill's podcast, or Ep111, and I spent literally all night doing the audio balancing. So I hope you like the audio balancing. And if you don't like the audio balancing, don't tell me, because I will scream at you. Because I spent all night messing with audio balancing. That's why I'm still wearing the same clothes. But let's move on. One other thing. The fact that we've had 24 hours to think since the last time we spoke, I realized there was something. Remember that point I made about the people who live online and who would be most affected by Twitter, and you said that I showed some empathy. Thank you for that. Well, let me show a bit more empathy, because something just occurred to me afterwards. And I was thinking about them, and I was thinking about when I got hacked, my Twitter account got hacked, and they deleted my entire archive, all my followers and all my tweets. Now, I've been on Twitter since like 2008, and I've never said anything personal, ever. I don't trust social media. I never say anything personal. All I did was just tweet out links to science stuff, right? Because that's what I'm into. And I really miss them. Like the archive, I actually felt an absence. Like it was like they take away part of your history. It's like a photo album goes missing. Now that like your memories are attached to some of those things, and you'll never get them back again. They're gone. And I can see why people in particular are scared that if Musk sinks Twitter, that their archive of their life will go. Like if they live on Twitter. And I think that's worth mentioning, that is part of the fear and part of the concern that some people have about this. It's not just about who they're chatting to or whatever. Now it's about their entire last 15 years. And I think that's probably worth noting. So it says that. But anyway, I want to talk about two things in particular with you here, Melina. First of all, never gets discussed, Afghanistan. All right, ever since Biden bugged out of there, no one has been talking about Afghanistan. They just go, oh yeah, women are getting subjugated. They can't go to parks anymore and gyms. That's the latest one. But I don't know how you justify that. But anyway, a report came out from SIGA. That's the Special Investigator General, Special Inspector General into the Afghanistan reconstruction. About 2 weeks ago, got zero press coverage. It was about the problems, looking back in hindsight on the Afghanistan occupation. Honestly, you look it up on Google, the only mention, you might go, how do I know about it? It's because the only people who mentioned it, literally the only media outlet that mentioned it, was the Daily Wire, which is one of the conservative outlets that I read to know what conservatives are thinking. And I'll take my hats off to them. I know why they mention it. They mention it because they associate problems with Afghanistan with Joe Biden. But regardless, I don't care if there's a partisan motivation. They still at least reported fairly on a report which everyone should have been reporting on, because X billion dollars and X thousand lives and X hundreds of thousands of lives in Afghanistan were sunk in this conflagration, and it's had a massive impact on the world. So I think it's worth going back and looking what that to say. So I'm just going to go through it very, very quickly, and I'll put a link to it. It's about 60 pages, but it's very readable in the homework, so you can have a look yourself. Okay. First of all, they went through the basics about why it collapsed from a tactical point of view, Afghanistan. And none of this is amazing, but I'll just run it through you very quickly. Number one, the Afghanistan government didn't actually believe that America would leave. They just thought Biden would tear up Trump's agreement for partisan reasons, if nothing else. And they were shocked that Biden actually left. That's the first thing. Second thing, allowing the Taliban to exclude the Afghanistan government from talks with America when America was talking with the Taliban, that fatally wounded the government's credibility. That was a very, very big mistake from the Trump administration. They should not have done that. Number three, the Afghanistan government incorporated the Taliban into their government anyway towards the end, which strengthened the Taliban, and it made a deal unlikely because the Taliban thought, we've got this. And so the Taliban just refused to deal whatsoever because they thought they didn't need to. That's point number four. The Taliban refused to compromise, and America allowed them to refuse to compromise. They paid no price at any point in time for refusing to compromise. Point five, President Ghani operated through a very small circle of loyalists, leading him to have no idea what was actually going on in the country. So he was totally deluded. and he pissed off a lot of people who are excluded. When you have a small group of people in a circle of power, the people who would normally be in the circle of power, who know they would be in the circle of power if you went away, they get annoyed. And finally, point 6, their elections weren't taken seriously at all, and corruption was rife, allowing the Taliban to sell themselves as the only realistic alternative. At this point, I'm going to rejig the Zoom, and we'll continue after the white flash. Okay, now we're back from the white flash, and you might hear me a little bit better than you did before, because I have now discovered that for this entire podcast until now, I had my microphone the wrong way round. So if you're wondering why, hopefully I will be at least audible throughout the first 90% of the podcast, but I will be less clear. I'll be more echoey. I mean, I'll sound okay because I will have spent hours and hours and hours audio balancing myself so that you'll be able to at least hear me. But if you're wondering why I sounded a bit echoey for the first 90%, is because idiot Chaz had his microphone pointed in the wrong direction. But enjoy this last 10% of the podcast. Now let's continue on here, Melina. Now, point 6 was about how elections weren't taken seriously and corruption was rife. The report spends a lot of time focusing on 6. So let me give you a couple of examples about that, which we probably didn't know much of before, or at least not in this detail. All right, for a start, a bunch of money funded the Taliban directly without us realizing it, because they were running protection money rackets with on the people who we were giving, America was giving money to. So the Taliban were being funded by America directly, even though they didn't realize it at the time. But then on top of that, you got corruption. America didn't really focus on corruption for the first 7 years or so, because Bush was focused on anti-terrorism and he didn't want to do nation building at the time. Ironically, it became a lot about nation building after a certain amount of time. And there was a lot of impunity going on. What I'm referring to there is that the people they needed to fight the Taliban were the most corrupt people. So they had a choice of either fighting the Taliban or fighting corruption. They couldn't do both. And they chose the Taliban for a lot of that time. So sometimes they were turning a blind eye. And they've got an example here. The chief of police, General Razik, kept Kandahar quite secure. He was also deeply involved in the opium trade. He took a big cut out of customs revenue. He was associated with systematic torture and the disappearance of his political foes, and he murdered anyone who crossed him. He was known for murdering people. And no one ever charged him with human rights abuses. The US military knew about him, but just kept on funding him because they felt like they had no other choice, because he could keep the Taliban quiet. Because they were scared of him, because everyone was scared of him. So that's an example.
He murders a lot of people, probably.
Probably so?
Because he murders a lot of people, probably. Sounds scary.
Probably related, I imagine, the two. There were a number of government officials who reportedly committed acts of child sexual abuse and exploited their positions to extract resources from the population. Nothing happened to them. It contributed to a perception of the Afghan government as abusive and predatory. Reasonably. So the Taliban started to look good by comparison to some of these situations. It also created a situation where if you wanted to fight corruption, which as time went on, they tried to fight corruption, you needed to enlist the help of the people who were benefiting from corruption and abuses of power. And because all the people in charge were either corrupt or abusing their power. So what are you going to do about it? Like, unless you get in and run it yourself, which obviously they couldn't do, they had a problem. The percentage of Afghans who described corruption as a major problem in their daily life, here's a poll for you, Melina, trended steadily upward from 42% in 2006 to 61% in 2015. That's in their everyday life. Kabul Bank is a great example. In 2010, Kabul Bank almost collapsed because it was essentially a massive pyramid scheme, their bank. Hundreds of millions of dollars were fraudulently lent to fictitious companies in transactions that benefited politically connected Afghan shareholders who never paid back those loans. Meanwhile, the deposits by ordinary Afghan citizens were used to fund those fraudulent loans. So it was like a bit of a pyramid scheme in that respect. Withdrawals were paid for using Afghan police and army salaries that moved through the bank. Now you might go, hang on, didn't those guys miss their salaries? Well, they didn't miss their salaries for a very important reason, which we're going to come to in a second. We'll get back to that. Actually, no, let's tell you now. The reason why they didn't miss those salaries is because they didn't exist. Because these guys running the Kabul bank invented soldiers and invented police. They were called the ghost soldiers and the ghost police. So they could then take their salaries to fund their pyramid scheme. So prevalent were the ghost soldiers and ghost police that when Afghanistan collapsed, part of the reason was they expected there to be 14,000 police officers in Kandahar protecting the area. It turned out there were only 700 police officers. The rest were fictional. So that gives you an idea how over 15 years they had drained so much money, like literally hundreds of millions of dollars. In total, $982 million was stolen from Kabul Bank. Wow. Like that's a lot of money in a place where they not much cost much. You know, $982 million is a lot of money there. And the biggest beneficiaries were President Karzai's brother and the vice president's brother. They were the two guys that made out the most. And that's a problem when the people in charge are the ones plundering the bank. So people lost a lot of faith in the system and in democracy. Towards the end, Afghanistan only got 10% turnout for their elections. People just didn't believe in them. And the Taliban was only too happy to encourage that cynicism and to say that the corrupt Afghanistanis were just America's puppets. And finally, as well, America didn't really know what was going on, unsurprisingly, and they assumed anyone who was attacking them was the Taliban. But they weren't. They were sometimes loggers who were trying to protect their land from when American soldiers were moving through, or opium dealers, opium growers, drug dealers, who none of these people liked the Taliban, but they ended up having to fight with the Taliban because the American troops were fighting them like they were the Taliban, and so they needed the support of the Taliban to defend themselves. And so the Taliban grew in that respect as well. So those are the main factors that this report points out to as setting the scene for why Afghanistan collapsed. Do you have any thoughts about Afghanistan in general that you'd like to throw in there after that?
No, I think
that's all right.
I mean, it's just it's a very good summation of everything that was wrong. Do they go into any detail about, like, I'm assuming they critique the manner of Biden's withdrawal in particular?
Actually,
because I guess the thing is, like, those are all very, like, real and complicated problems, and to be honest, like, I still don't know, like, what do you do about it? What should they have done about it? What would have been a better way out, or should there not have been a way out? It's very messy. Yeah,
they actually didn't talk much about Biden's withdrawal at all. They were talking about the inherent factors of occupying Afghanistan and ways in which America could have occupied Afghanistan in a more effective way and tried to nation build in a more effective way. It was more about setting the scene for why. I think that what they were intimating was that no one could have withdrawn in a way that was going to work, because they were screwed either way. I don't think, but they weren't given a rubber stamp, that's for sure. They just didn't really talk about Biden's withdrawal much. But if you're interested, have a look and you can see for yourself. It's mostly about Afghanistan, the Afghans themselves, rather than how America withdrew. Now,
I mean, it always felt from the beginning that, like, America went into Afghanistan off the back of 9/11. There was a logic to why. And I just remember from the very beginning that they suddenly started talking about Iraq, being very confused about why they were talking about it and what that had to do with anything. And I mean, I was like a lot younger back then, it's a long time ago now. And, I was didn't know heaps about politics, and it still just seemed very peculiar to me and random and a non sequitur from the war on terror and 9/11. And it just always felt from the beginning that, like, any chance, whether they ever could have come out of Afghanistan looking good. I don't know, but certainly any chance they would have ever had of doing that, I think, was immediately and irreparably ruined as soon as they went on a massive diversion and devoted all their attention and resources to a different war, while still maintaining this other one in an incredibly complicated country that no one's really been able to successfully invade in the past. Kind of the original sin, I think.
But invading Iraq probably did not help. That is true. Yes. Last podcast 2 days ago with Bill, I spoke very briefly about investigations that the Republicans were planning to take on. I've got an investigation for them here. If they want to investigate something that I actually think is a potentially massive scandal, I wouldn't go so far as to say impeachable scandal, but potentially getting there, depending on what they find. I don't think they're going to do this, but if they want an investigation, here's one for you involving Afghanistan, which is that SIGAR have had a lot to say recently. There was that report there. SIGAR, the Inspector General I'm talking about, had one more thing to say a couple of weeks back. I've been saving this because I haven't had the time because we've been talking elections the whole time. They reported to Congress to say, I'm just going to read some quotes for you. The United States remains Afghanistan's single largest donor, having provided more than $1.1 billion in assistance to support the Afghan people since the Taliban's takeover in August 2021. Oh, that's interesting. They're funding the Taliban. I didn't know that because that's where that money's going. You can be sure about that. But wait, that's not the bit I'm talking about. Let's keep on going. However, SIGAR, for the first time in its history, is unable this quarter to provide Congress and the American people with a full accounting of this US government spending due to the non-cooperation of several US government agencies. The United States Agency for International Development, which administers the majority of US government spending for Afghanistan, and the Treasury Department refused to cooperate with SIGAR in any capacity, while the State Department was selective in the information it provided pursuant to SIGAR's audit and quarterly data requests, sharing high-level funding data but not details of agency-supported programs in Afghanistan. This is in direct violation of, and they cite the law, SIGAR has notified Congress of this matter. Okay, so the Biden administration is freezing out the Inspector General to hide what they are up to in Afghanistan. That is what is going on. Now, I don't know. I mean, need to be careful here. I don't know if this is a Treasury Department level or a foreign affairs level, or if it's at a higher level. But if it is at a higher level, that is a massive, massive issue. And the reason I say if, I don't think I'm being irresponsible, because when there's two completely different departments that are both doing the same thing, it suggests that someone higher up is coordinating it. And so that's the reason why I say if at a higher level. And when I say a higher level, I don't necessarily mean Biden here. It could be his chief of staff, like Ron Klain. It could be any number of people. But the fact is that Bush didn't obstruct SIGAR. Obama didn't obstruct SIGAR. Bloody Trump didn't obstruct SIGAR, but Biden is, or someone working for Biden is. And that is shocking. And if anyone cared about Afghanistan anymore, that would be a massive, massive scandal. And so that is something that someone should investigate and get to the bottom of, I reckon, because whoever is responsible for that needs to explain why. That, in my view, is terrible. What are your thoughts?
Well, it's, I can't obviously know what their motivations are if they are hiding it, but it's curious thing to do at this point in time when, as you say, people don't care that much anymore. It's not a big issue. And if anyone can kind of be like shirk responsibility for what's going on in Afghanistan, it's Biden, who's, basically ended the war there. So it's like surprising to me. Like, I can't understand why they would have more to hide than his predecessors. So I don't really know what to say, because I don't know why they would be trying to obstruct the investigation in the first place.
Fair. That's why we should investigate and find out. I agree. Yes. Okay. Saudi Arabia. I'm just jumping all over the place here. Last week, a story came out that the Biden administration told the court that Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman should be immune from a lawsuit for killing the journalist Khashoggi in America. And the reason for that is because MBS, as we'll now call him, Mohammed bin Salman, is now the Saudi prime minister. And as a general policy, heads of state should not be are considered in America to be immune from lawsuits. You can understand why they do that. There's good reason for that, because if they don't make heads of state immune from lawsuits, then American heads of state will not be immune from lawsuits in other countries. They'll be tit for tat. And then before you know it, the American politicians or American presidents can't travel to other countries for fear of being sued or being arrested or whatever. And there's all kinds of diplomatic issues there. I can understand that. I'm not knocking that at all. But at the most basic level, Biden seems like a hypocrite because he was talking tough about making MBS a pariah during the election campaign. I won't even play the clip. You've all seen it before. What he said was, I was giving you a quote, I think it was a flat out murder, he said during a town hall, and I think we should have nailed it as that. I publicly said at the time we should treat it that way and there should be consequences relating to how we deal with that power. Okay. So that's the overall story. Okay. So Biden at one point in time was talking tough about MBS, and now he's saying he's making a submission to a court saying that he feels, or his department feels, that MBS should be immune from lawsuits. At this point in time, I will. Do you have any thoughts so far?
No, you keep going.
Okay, all right. Obviously we're going to go deeper than that because, for a start, MBS wasn't prime minister until quite recently. And so you go, okay, so when did he become prime minister and how and why? Because the argument that's been used by some is that the reason MBS is the prime minister is to stop him being subject to these kinds of lawsuits. All right, so let's explore this a little bit further. Oh, I should also say that the court doesn't have to listen to the recommendation. That's a recommendation from Biden, from the Attorney General's Department, but it's just a recommendation. It's not an order. The court can ignore that. Okay. But the court is going to listen to them, so it might as well be an order. Anyway, turns out MBS became prime minister on the 27th of September. And he wasn't supposed to be the prime minister. By Saudi law, the king is supposed to be the prime minister. The king is not MBS. The king is his dad. But his dad decided to make MBS PM, which is an exception to the law, just for once, on the 27th of September. And it wasn't expected to make any practical changes whatsoever to that, because MBS is the effective ruler anyway. So he wasn't going to make any changes, but he wasn't meant to do that. So let's see what the newspapers wrote about on the 28th of September, before any of this happened. On the 20th of September, The Guardian wrote, Mohammed bin Salman has been named Prime Minister of Saudi Arabia in a move that experts said would probably shield the Crown Prince from a potentially damaging lawsuit in the US in connection to his alleged role in the murder of the journalist Jamal Khashoggi. That was the first paragraph of the article. Okay, so at the time it happened, people were calling bullshit right then and there. Okay, so that's the first thing to note when we're digging a little bit deeper. In real time, everyone knew what was going on. Okay, so then I'm thinking to myself, well, hang on. Saudi Arabia probably outflanked America. They were probably smarter than America. And even though we can see through this transparent move, America, for whatever reason, didn't see it coming. They got surprised by it. The Saudis outflanked them, and then America had no choice but to go through with their diplomatic protocols. Yeah? In which case you go, okay, they're a bit dumb, but, you know, we're not all perfect. We all make mistakes. Fair enough. But wait, it turns out that the Biden administration did not have to express a view as to whether MBS should be immune or not. If they got outflanked, they could have just shut up. The judge asked them if they had a submission to make, and they chose to make the submission. Okay, so that's the next thing. But even worse, the judge didn't ask them to make that submission on the 29th of September or after MBS was Prime Minister. They asked them to make that submission by the 1st of August. They asked them back in July to make that submission by the 1st of August. And then the administration sought an extension to make that submission until the 3rd of October. And just before then is when MBS changed his title. So I don't want to be cynical, but reading between the lines, it seems to me like the administration probably worded up MBS and said, this is what you need to do. So like they sought an extension to give them time to do this. And then they worded them up. And then when MBS changed, when the king changed MBS's status, then they shrugged and go, oh, what can you do? He's the prime minister. I'm sorry. Oh, oops. Look at that. Oh, no. Protocols. So that seems to me, maybe I'm cynical, but it seems to me a little bit like, once again, America is Saudi Arabia's bitch. That's what it sounds like to me. And why that's the case, when Saudi Arabia was screwing over America on petrol at exactly the same time that this was going on, I have no idea. And remember, there were the Democrats and Republicans, everyone was talking tough about, oh yeah, Saudi Arabia, we're going to sort them out. We don't need them anymore. Well, the administration was bending over backwards they didn't have to do anything. They could have just stayed out of it and let the law take its turn. And the law could have dealt with MBS and they could have kept their hands clean, but they didn't want to do that. They were bending over backwards to help MBS at that point in time. So what are your thoughts about all that, Melina?
Yeah, I've read about I've heard some people sort of frame the MBS taking on the prime minister title as kind of more something that enhances his claim rather than it being like that, he is effectively the head of state, just in a different system to like America and Australia. And so he is probably still entitled to immunity under that principle, but getting the title prime minister just kind of removes the ambiguity by kind of naming him in terms that, America's system more clearly recognizes, because MBS's dad is technically still in charge, but is old and not really running it anymore. So I don't know if that's like the difference maker between him getting the immunity or not, but obviously it helps. The thing to me, which just seems like dodgier, like obviously, yeah, like seemingly the Biden administration helping with the timing to try and just like help along their claim. And I mean, this kind of like system of not allowing heads of state to be sued makes sense for the reasons you said, but then you see like the obvious limitations of that when you have heads of state that murder people. Yes. That's where it becomes really awkward, this principle. No, I shouldn't say, I don't mean to be flippant about it, but it's just, the logic underpinning that system makes sense, but then it suddenly feels like no longer logical when you're faced with this obviously horrible crime that's just so outside the realm of what we would consider acceptable for a head of state. Obviously people talk about, heads of states being murderers because of things to do with like assassinations on the battlefield, or, like America taking out terrorists and stuff. Some people might say that's murder. Some people would say Obama firing drones is murder, like sue Obama in a foreign court, and America's political system doesn't want something like that to happen. That's more subjective. But I mean, the Khashoggi case is just obviously nothing like that. Is so far outside the realm of what anyone would consider acceptable for a state to do. And so suddenly it doesn't fit within this protocol, which is awkward. And then the other thing that I think, is worthy of criticism is the fact that Biden obviously mouthed off on the campaign about, oh, it's murder, we should freeze them out, and then has just completely capitulated. Like, if he wanted to be all realpolitik and care about oil and not really not want to upset diplomatic protocols, if he shouldn't have been going out saying these things in the first place. The hypocrisy of campaigning on being this person who's like just so decent that he doesn't care about the oil, he's gonna stand by the principles of human rights, and then to very quickly capitulate and, as you say, go out of his way to help them. Whether it makes a huge difference or not to what the legal proceedings ultimately would have ended up determining is not a great look.
No. I've got one more thing I'd say, Saudi Arabia, and then I think I'm going to burn my final topic because it's getting too late. and when you hear what the final topic was that I'm going to burn, you'll be very amused, because I've spoken for the last month and a half about the fact I have to address this topic, and I'm not going to do it. related to oil, the strategic reserve, I need to explain something very quickly because this is going to continue over the next little while. The strategic reserve is like a giant reservoir of oil underground in case of emergencies, okay? Like natural disasters or oil shocks, that kind of thing. It's a great idea. They started in 1975. They gradually fill it up over 10 years. It takes about 725 million barrels of oil that they've got stored there. Before this year, they only used it 3 times for emergencies. At the beginning of the Gulf War in 1991, after Hurricane Katrina in 2005, and in 2011 after there was a supply shock in Libya during the Arab Spring. Now, every now and then they'll sell off 10 or 20 million barrels to round off a price shock or something like that. It never drops more than 30 million barrels at a time though. Like they keep it pretty steady up the top there. Here's the graph. If you want to have a look, you can't see it, Melina. Those at home can see it. What you'll see is that it's basically been at pretty close to full for the entire last 30, 40 years. And then there's a huge drop off under Biden this year. It dropped from 640 million barrels to 392 million barrels, and it's still dropping in a little over 6 months. It's down to 54% of capacity. And that's entirely about keeping the price of oil as low as possible when running into the election. There's just no doubt what was going on there. There are added benefits as well, though. It's not just that. If they hold off refilling it until the price of oil drops, and Biden has promised to do that, then that will set a floor on oil prices, which will provide a nice little subsidy for oil companies, which Biden will hope will provide an incentive for oil companies to do a little bit more drilling right now to try and increase supply and reduce prices. So there's a leaving aside the environment for a second and climate change, there is from an energy policy point of view, there is a lot of rationale, a lot of logic to the method they are pursuing at the moment with the strategic reserve. Hello. Looks like Melina might have dropped out. And Melina's back. Thank you so much, Melina. You're really going beyond the call for this podcast. What device are you on now? Because your laptop battery died, yeah?
Yes, I'm on my mobile phone.
Okay, all right. Okay, I'll try to stop. That's a real sign that your podcast is going too long. When in the second half, the person's laptop battery dies. So I'm going to try to wrap up before your phone dies as well. Okay, so anyway, so we got the strategic reserve going down. Biden has been using this to keep the price of oil in a reasonable bound for reasonable bounds for America, and there's an economic logic to what he's doing. So for that, and probably it's quite popular as well, I imagine, because people like oil prices not being too high, and they like the idea of encouraging greater drilling at a time when oil prices are high. So that would probably be popular, which means this is probably going to be the normal from now on. Politicians will continue to do that kind of thing, I suspect, and that's that's fine. But you might go, especially, hey, look, there's plenty of strategic reserve left. They've still got 400 million barrels. Who cares? That's enough for any emergency. It is. But now they've started using it like this. They're going to keep on using it like this. And let's see how long there's a lot left. That's the first thing. The second thing is, it's not a can of Pepsi. It's not designed to be emptied and filled and emptied and filled and emptied and filled as much as you like. Because it's pretty hard to store 725 million barrels of oil underground. And I want to quote to you Tristan Abbey, a former senior staffer on the Senate Energy Committee and National Security Council, who wrote a letter about this to Joe Manchin a few months back. Quote, I am gravely concerned that the current administration's ongoing series of sales from the Strategic Petroleum Reserve threatens its operational viability. The reserve consists primarily of underground salt caverns filled with oil and a system of wells, pipelines and pumps that use water and brine to control where that oil is transported. Every single fill and refill stresses the structural integrity of this system. In the same way the sandcastle is not designed to withstand repeated waves, neither is the SPR designed for endless cycles of tactical market intervention. The SPR system is also sensitive to pressurization, corrosion, and byproducts of repeated use that can affect its storage and distribution capabilities. In short, the SPR degrades with each drawdown. So you might forget that in 5 years or 10 years when it happens, but if you remember, you heard it here first. This is not a long-term strategy. And number 3, Congress has been playing funny budget tricks with the strategic reserve for some time to pay the bills. This was invented under Obama. In 2015, with the Bipartisan Budget Act of 2015, they promised to sell 58 million barrels of oil from the strategic reserve during fiscal years 2018 to 2025. And they added the proceeds from that sale to the revenue of the bill, so it didn't go into deficit. So, and ever since then, everyone said, that's a great idea. Let's sell lots of oil over the next 10 years to make money that we will count now in our bill as part of that budget window. And therefore this bill is not a deficit bill. It's a revenue raiser, you see, which is extremely cynical. And it goes right next to all the other budget tricks that they use to make these bills seem like they're revenue raisers when they're actually deficit raisers. But they keep on doing it. They're doing it over and over again in every bill now. And this is not just a Democrat thing. Trump was doing it as well. Lots of funny money. There is now 358 million barrels of oil that has to be sold over the next 10 years because of previous funny money tricks with budgets, right? They've just counted 70 million of them that they just sold now. They sold more than 70 million, but there's only 70 million in the budget window that we're currently in. So there are 288 million barrels left to be sold over the next 10 years. And they'll be spread out, sure. But it means there's going to be constant misuse and abuse of the strategic reserve over the next 10 years, even without any of this messing around for petrol prices. Okay, and do you think they're going to stop doing that with the budget? No way. They're going to keep on doing it over and over and over again until someone stops them, and no one's going to stop them because no one's even heard of it. You hadn't heard of it. I hadn't heard of it until I read this recently. It's the perfect crime. So, and they both do it. So neither of them is going to blow the whistle on the other one, right? So what I'm saying is, it's party time at the moment with the strategic reserve, but that's not going to last. So just bear that in mind. They have a problem coming with the strategic reserve. I don't know if it's next year. I don't know if it's in 10 years, but it's coming. And I just wanted to flag it now because this is exactly the kind of thing that I hope you listen to PEP for. That kind of detail that you don't get anywhere else. And it's beauty. So I want to get it out there before the end of the year. And that is where I'm going to end it. The topic, which I'm not going to cover, is going to be all the things that they were going to do in the lame duck period that I have been threatening to cover over and over again. The truth is they're not going to be doing any of that stuff anyway. It was just me being like a Mary Poppins about legislation that I loved, that people were trying to get through. And I was going to go, well, give this person a hand for this great idea and that person a hand, that great idea. I might just put it in a document and just paste it on the website or something. I don't know, but whatever. All you need to know about the lame duck period is that they are not going to raise the debt ceiling like they should. That should be the number one priority, but they're not going to do that. I already told you that a few weeks ago that I realized they weren't going to do it. What I didn't know is that Joe Manchin explicitly has come out against it because he actually thinks it's good for them to have a budget crisis because he thinks that they need to deal with the problems of entitlement spending, out of control entitlement spending. And that they will when they have a massive budget crisis. When we return in about 6 months' time, I'll get to talk to you all about that then. That will do. Now, let's say our goodbyes. Melina, I just want to say, first of all, thank you so much for doing this. And we should tell them about the show that we are going to be working on in the next 6 months.
Yeah.
because I've told people that we're going to be coming back. The podcast will come back in June. the Planet America will come back in July, and then we're going to go straight through with like 2 weeks of holiday here and there. But we'll go straight through to after the 2024 elections. There's going to be 18 straight months of Planet America. But until then, Melina and I are working on a TV show, which doesn't have a name. We put as a working title on the publicity blurb that came out on Thursday, which is a few days ago. Now you're watching this, but it was yesterday in our time. We called it No Stupid Questions as a working title. Another working title is Answering Machine. The original title is actually Ask Us Anything, and that says what it is. It's a show where we are, the reporters are me, Lawrence Lung, Cameron James, Kirsten Drysdale, Alex Lee, and Louise Wall. And Melina's going to be behind the scenes. She's going to be a producer and writer and doing all the stuff that she always does to support TV shows. And we're going to be taking questions from you about anything, probably not consumer affairs. I've done enough of that, but anything else, whether it's economics or science or history or just current affairs or whatever's on your mind. Don't make it a question that you can look up on Google and find the answer in 3 seconds, because that's a waste of everyone's time. But anything else, like anything at all that you can't find the answer to that you're interested in, and we'll go away and do a report. Sometimes they'll be silly reports, sometimes they'll be very in-depth reports, and we'll try and do our best to give you an answer. And that's going to be on from, I think, around May next year, but we're going to be working on it for 3-4 months before then, because they're going to be real reports, these reports, right? So we need questions now. And I will be soliciting questions a lot over the next few months. But if you have any questions of anything you want to answer, just put them in the comments. I will see them and we will answer them. We want to take real questions here, okay? And we want to answer them. Have I missed anything out about that show, Melina? There's anything you want to say about it?
No, it's going to be fun.
I hope so. Anyway, so yeah, so that is how we're going to be spending our day. In fact, I'm going to start working on it like tomorrow. In fact, I already have. Shh. Don't tell John Barron. I've been working on it a little bit for a while. But I'm going to get straight into that and try and do some research, because I've got a few questions that I want to ask myself and try and get to the bottom of. So we're doing that. And do you have any party messages, Melina, for the punters out there? No?
Hope everyone has a great break.
That sounds good.
Yes, you'll be working.
Yeah. Oh, well, look, at least I'll be sleeping. So that is, working while sleeping is a break for me. My only message to people is I'm going to tune out from American politics now. I'm not going to be reading for the next 6 months because I'll be busy doing other stuff. Might I suggest that you guys don't do the same thing. Don't tune out for 6 months, but take a break every now and then. Because I find that American politics is so intense and so maddening, and the psychos are so frustrating that it kind of takes a piece out of you. It really does. It actually kind of makes you different if you just get sucked in. And you see these people on the internet all the time who become shadows of who they might have once been before they got sucked into this vortex. So it reminds me of a quote that gets sent around on the internet a bit. So I don't know if it's true. I hope it is. Supposedly from Nietzsche. And what it is battle not with monsters, lest ye become a monster. And if you gaze into the abyss gazes also into you. I always think about that when I get sucked into American politics. That's the abyss gazing into me. So just take a week or two off every now and then and just shut the abyss up before it takes a piece of you. That's my only goodbye message. As you can probably hear, the sound quality has changed because I've taken the microphone out. It's probably better now. And I am, and the reason I've done that is because I want to leave you, and especially you, Melina, but you as well at home. Thank you so much for all you've done, listening to the podcast, the comments, the well-wishing. I appreciate all of it, even though I don't talk about it much online or in person because it's very self-indulgent, but I do really appreciate it. Thank you very much. I'll leave you with this gift, a Xmas Whippet.
Yes.
Here we are. Here we are. Merry Christmas. See you guys later. Bye-bye.